Hello everyone. Tonight, we're going on an adventure that might surprise you, maybe even more than your history teacher or your grandma. Just imagine finding out that history's greatest thinkers went to parties with lots of wine, not many clothes, and talk that would get you kicked out of most family dinners now. But what's really surprising is that these parties weren't just for fun. They were where big ideas about love, wanting things, and what it means to be human were born. What if I said that Plato, the one you see quoted on social media, came up with his biggest idea about love while watching other thinkers, who weren't wearing much, argue about whether sex stops you from becoming truly wise? And the wildest thing is, he decided that enjoying physical things could be bad for you, but not in the way you might guess. Before we jump into this world where smart people looked into the deepest secrets of human wanting, please hit the subscribe button and like this video, but only if you're really curious about these hidden stories that shaped our world. I'm also curious, are you watching this late? Maybe just scrolling before you go to sleep? Let me know in the comments what time it is for you and what made you click on this video tonight. Now, let's lower the lights, get cozy, perhaps put on a fan for some soft noise, and go back to old Athens, where the line between being wise and having fun was about to be changed forever. Athens, or 16 BC, the sun sets behind the big marble columns of the Acropolis and oil lamps start to light up the city. Tonight, you've been invited to something that will change how you see old wisdom. The invitation is from Agathon, a young writer who just won a big prize, and he's having what the Greeks called a symposium. Now, forget what you think a symposium is. It wasn't a dull meeting. Think of it as a mix of interesting talks, wine, and things that would definitely get a video taken down today. As you walk through the marble halls of Agathon's house, your shoes making a soft sound on the floor, you can already hear things. Laughter bouncing off the painted walls, the soft sound of a stringed instrument, and quiet conversations that are about to change how we understand love. You go into the main room, and what you see would surprise most people now. Men are lying on nice couches, wearing fine clothes with bowls of fruit nearby. But if you look closer, you'll see these are not just rich guys at a party. That man with the funny nose and sharp eyes, waving his wine cup around, that's Socrates, the thinker who said he knew nothing but seemed to know everything. The one telling jokes that were so dirty they'd make today's comedians blush. That's Aristophanes, a writer whose plays were so shocking he almost got kicked out of the city. But this is when the night changes in a way that would affect the world for the next 2,000 years. As the wine, mixed with water in fancy bowls, starts to be served, the talk moves from government and art to something much more personal: what love really is. And all around the room, making the party more beautiful and smart, are the heterae. These women were some of the most educated and respected people in Athens, even though women were usually kept out of sight. They weren't just for show. They were thinkers, musicians, and good talkers who could argue with the best minds there. The Greeks had a word for the perfect feeling they were trying to find: euprosine. It was a special kind of happiness that came from a perfect mix of wine, smart talk, and being with people. They thought that with the right amount of wine, you could say true things that you'd normally keep hidden. Too little, and you're stuck in your normal way of thinking. Too much, and you can't think clearly enough for real understanding. As the night gets later, you see a young man in the corner, watching everything very closely. His name is Plato, and he's making notes in his head that will become some of the most important ideas ever. He's watching how everyone is acting, how physical attraction leads to deep thoughts, how wanting something seems to lead to something bigger than itself, how people get lost in pleasure and then come out with new ideas. But this is where you see how smart Plato is, and why his ideas would shock everyone there. As he watches a young man fall head over heels for the handsome and charming Alcibiades, Plato doesn't just see someone being attracted to looks, he sees something huge happening. A soul remembering something godly, but getting the copy mixed up with a real thing. Imagine that moment. Alcibiades walks in and everyone stops talking. He's not just good-looking. He has a kind of power that makes everyone look at him. The young man watching him can't speak. His heart beats fast. His whole world is now about this one person. Most people would say this is love, or at least a strong attraction. But Plato looks at this and thinks, what if this strong feeling is the soul remembering something it lost a long time ago? According to Plato's new idea, when you're drawn to physical beauty, you're really reacting to a faint memory of perfect beauty itself, a perfect idea that is beyond our world. It's like living in a cave your whole life, only seeing shadows, and then suddenly seeing a bit of real sunlight. It's that feeling in your stomach when you see someone really attractive. That's your soul seeing something special, but mixing up the reflection with the real thing. This is where Plato's famous idea of a ladder of love starts to form, right there in that room full of wine and deep talk. He watches people start with physical attraction, and he sees it as the first step on a ladder that leads to something amazing. First, you're attracted to one beautiful body. Second, you see that all beautiful bodies have something in common. They all reflect beauty itself. Third, you start to see beautiful souls, not just bodies. Fourth, you fall in love with beautiful ideas, knowledge, and wisdom. And last, if you're brave enough to keep going up, you get to the top, a direct connection with beauty itself, the divine thing that makes everything else beautiful. But here's the game-changing part, and this is what made Plato's ideas so debated even in that room of open-minded people. He wasn't saying physical love was bad. He was saying it was not the whole story. To stop at physical pleasure, for Plato, was like finding a treasure map and not going to find the treasure. As the party goes on late into the night, as the lamps get dim and the talks get deeper, you can almost see Plato's mind working, putting together ideas no one had before. He's watching people chase physical pleasure and get stuck, a point where no amount of physical good feeling can satisfy a deeper need. And he's thinking, the soul is trying to find its way back to something it remembers but can't name. The funny thing is, Plato came up with his idea about going beyond physical desire while surrounded by some of the most pleasure-seeking parties in history. But that's why his thoughts were so strong. He wasn't just thinking in a quiet room. He was watching real people in all their messy, wonderful reality. As the sun starts to come up, as the last talks end and people slowly walk home through the quiet streets, Plato takes with him the beginnings of ideas that will be talked about for centuries, the link between the body and soul, what true love is, and the idea that our deepest wants might point to something bigger. All of it figured out in real time, in the middle of real human life. But if you think Plato's ideas were groundbreaking, wait until you hear what his most famous student thought. Because Aristotle, the man who would teach Alexander the Great and become one of history's top thinkers, looked at his teacher's ladder of love and basically said, "Plato, I think you're missing the point." In a minute, we'll find out how Aristotle's view of love and desire was so different from Plato's that it started a debate that still affects how we see relationships today. And Aristotle's answer to the problem of physical pleasure versus spiritual growth might be just what you need to. Here, picture this. You're Aristotle, just 20 years old, walking into Plato's school for the first time. It's 367 BC. And you've come from a small town to Athens with only your father's medical knowledge and a huge curiosity. You're about to spend the next 20 years learning from the man who would be called the greatest thinker in history. But what no one tells you about this famous teacher-student relationship is that it was basically a 20-year-long argument that would change how people think about love, desire, and living a good life. Your teacher, Plato, has just explained his ladder of love idea. Physical attraction, he says, is just the first step, something that stops you from reaching true wisdom. But you, Aristotle, are sitting there thinking, wait a second, my dad was a doctor. I've seen how the body works. And what you're saying sounds like you've never really been in love. This is where one of the biggest arguments in philosophy starts, and it's about to give us ideas about relationships that modern psychology is just now understanding. You see, Aristotle had something Plato didn't, a very practical mind and a background in science. His father was the personal doctor to a king. From a young age, Aristotle understood the human body not as a cage for the soul, but as a wonderful machine that worked perfectly with the mind. So when Plato talked about getting past physical desire, Aristotle was thinking, but why would nature give us such strong feelings if we were supposed to ignore them? This is where Aristotle's brilliance comes out. Instead of just saying Plato was wrong about love and beauty, he asked a new question. What if the point isn't to run away from physical desire, but to find the perfect balance? This wasn't just an idea for Aristotle, it was personal. Because while Plato never married and seemed to not trust romantic love, Aristotle fell deeply in love. Her name was Pythias. When Aristotle met her, something happened that would make him question everything his teacher had taught him about the link between physical attraction and growing as a person. Imagine Aristotle, now in his late 30s, feeling that rush of attraction that Plato said was the lowest kind of love. But instead of seeing it as a problem to be fixed, Aristotle saw it as information to be studied. He was a scientist at heart. And what he saw in his own relationship with Pythias led him to a groundbreaking idea. Physical love and spiritual connection weren't enemies. They were partners. This is where Aristotle came up with what we call the golden mean. The idea that being good is about finding a balance, not going to extremes. And he used this idea for love and sex in a way that was very new for his time. Think of it like this. Plato said, climb the ladder and leave physical desire behind. Aristotle said, what if the ladder isn't for climbing away from physical love, but for climbing through it? According to Aristotle, a truly good relationship needed three things working together: physical attraction, deep friendship, and what he called sharing goodness, the way two people help each other become better people. But here's where Aristotle's ideas get really useful and why they might be exactly what today's relationships are missing. He noticed that couples who tried to build relationships on just one of these things always had problems. Pure physical attraction without friendship became obsessive and bad. Deep friendship without physical connection felt like something was missing. And trying to have a purely spiritual connection often made people feel out of touch with their with their own bodies. Aristotle saw people around him making these mistakes all the time. He saw men who were so focused on physical beauty that they couldn't really connect with the person they said they loved. He saw others who were so focused on being smart together that they forgot they were real people with physical needs. And he saw people who tried to follow Plato's advice about getting past physical desire, only to become cold and out of touch with their own feelings. So Aristotle suggested something new. What if the best kind of love actually needed all three parts working together? What if physical attraction, instead of being a distraction from real love, was actually a key part of it? This wasn't just an idea for Aristotle. His relationship with Pythias was his lab for testing these ideas. Old records say they had one of the best marriages in ancient Greece, a partnership that had passionate attraction, smart company, and helping each other be good. When Pythias died after they were married for a few years, Aristotle was so loyal to her memory that he never married again. He did later have a loving relationship with another woman who had a son with him. But here's the interesting part. Aristotle's view of love was closely tied to his understanding of how people can live well in general. He believed that people were meant to live what he called eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness, but really means something more like a flourishing life or living well. And according to Aristotle, you couldn't live well by ignoring parts of your nature. Instead, you had to bring all parts of yourself, physical, emotional, smart, and spiritual, together into a balanced whole. This meant that sexuality, instead of being a roadblock to a good life, was actually a key part of it when understood and done right. Now, you might be asking, how did Aristotle define understood and practiced right? This is where his golden mean idea is very important. He saw that problems didn't come from physical desire itself, but from going to extremes, either giving in to every desire or completely denying it. Aristotle noticed that people who gave in to every physical urge, without control, became slaves to their wants, always looking for the next bit of pleasure but never finding real happiness. On the other hand, people who tried to completely shut down their physical side often became stiff, unhappy, and out of touch with their own humanity. The solution, according to Aristotle, was what he called temperance, not getting rid of physical pleasure, but fitting it into a good life in the right way. This meant enjoying physical closeness as part of a deeper connection, not as a way to escape from it. It meant being aware of your desire instead of being controlled by it. It meant understanding that physical attraction could be a door to deeper love, but only if you walk through that door instead of just standing in front of it. But this is where Aristotle's ideas become almost prophetic for today's relationships. He pointed out 3 common mistakes people make when trying to balance physical attraction with deeper connection. Mistakes that relationship experts today are still helping people with. The first mistake is thinking physical attraction is either totally unimportant or the only thing that matters. Aristotle saw that both extremes cause problems. If you ignore physical chemistry, relationships don't have the energy and passion to stay alive. If you make it the only thing that matters, you miss the deeper things that make love last. The second mistake is believing that physical attraction and intellectual connection are fighting against each other. Aristotle saw that in the best relationships, these things actually made each other better. Physical closeness made smart connection more fun and happy. Being intellectually compatible made physical connection more fulfilling and lasting. The third mistake is thinking you have to choose between being a spiritual person and a physical person. Aristotle's new idea was that the most spiritually developed people were often those who had learned to bring all parts of their nature, including their sexuality, together into a complete whole. What's amazing is how much Aristotle's observations match what modern studies tell us about good, long-term relationships. Studies regularly show that couples who keep both emotional closeness and physical connection are happier and stay together longer. The relationships that have problems are often those where one part has been ignored or seen as unimportant. But Aristotle went even further. He suggested that learning to balance physical desire with deeper love was actually a way to build character, a way of becoming a more whole and grown-up person. In his view, people who could handle this balance well were showing the same kind of wisdom they needed for every other part of life. Think about it, the self-awareness needed to understand your own desires without being controlled by them. The communication skills needed to build both physical and emotional closeness. The patience needed to let relationships grow naturally instead of rushing to get what you want right away. These are all things that make someone a better friend, a better coworker, a better person. This is why Aristotle believed that good relationships weren't just nice to have. They were actually necessary for people to flourish. In his view, we learn to be good not by thinking about it in theory, but through the real challenge of loving another person well. And that included learning to love them physically without forgetting who they were as a whole person. Now, I'm curious. Does this sound like your own experience? Have you ever noticed how physical attraction and deeper connection can either make each other better or seem to work against each other, depending on how you handle them? Leave a comment and let me know what you think. Do you see relationships more like Plato or more like Aristotle? As we go deeper into our journey through old wisdom about love and desire, we're about to meet thinkers who took these questions in an even more extreme direction. Because while Plato and Aristotle were arguing about whether physical pleasure helped or hurt spiritual growth, there was a group of thinkers who looked at this whole conversation and said, "You're both missing the point." The real question isn't how to balance desire with wisdom. It's how to become so wise that desire can't bother you. Next, we'll look at the Stoics, thinkers who came up with a way of handling sexuality that was so practical and smart that modern therapists are using. Their methods again, and their answer to the age-old question of how to deal with physical desire might be the most surprising one we've seen yet. Now imagine you're Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world. In your tent on the German border around 170 AD outside, your soldiers are getting ready for another tough battle. Inside, you're writing in your private journal thoughts that were never meant to be seen by others, but would become one of history's most important books. And what's surprising is that this emperor, this warrior, this man who could have any pleasure he wanted, is writing about sex like it's just another bodily function, no more important than eating breakfast. Here's what he actually wrote, and I'm putting it in simpler words because his was pretty direct. Sex is just internal pressure being released, with some pleasure and fluid. Not exactly romantic, is it? But before you write this off as the thoughts of a repressed leader, think about this. Marcus Aurelius wasn't denying himself pleasure. He was married, had kids, and from what we know, lived a full life. So why did he describe closeness in such a technical way? The answer shows one of the smartest approaches to desire ever created. And it's an approach that modern therapy is rediscovering with amazing results. Marcus Aurelius was part of a school of thought called Stoicism, started in Athens around 300 BC by a man named Zeno of Citium. But these weren't the emotionless, stiff people that the word Stoic makes us think of today. The original Stoics were very practical thinkers who asked one main question: how do you live a good life in a world full of things you can't control? And when it came to sex and desire, their answer was revolutionary. Don't try to get rid of desire that's impossible and not healthy. Instead, learn to watch it without being controlled by it. Understand what it really is. Separate from all the stories and feelings you add to it. Let me tell you about Epictetus, a Stoic thinker whose view on desire was shaped by experiences that would crush most people. Born into slavery around 50 AD, he spent his early years working for one of Emperor Nero's cruelest officials. Imagine learning about freedom and self-control when you have no freedom at all. But what's amazing is that even as a slave, Epictetus created ways to stay free inside that were so strong they influenced emperors and generals for centuries. And his thoughts about desire were especially deep because he knew what it was like to want things but have no power to get them. Epictetus taught what he called the discipline of desire, a practice that sounds easy but takes incredible mental strength. When you feel sexual attraction or any strong desire, instead of acting on it right away or trying to push it down, you stop and watch it. You notice the physical feelings, the thoughts that come up, the emotions that go with it. But you don't judge any of it as good or bad. You just see it for what it is. Here's how this might work in real life. You see someone attractive and feel that usual rush of interest. Instead of immediately dreaming about them or trying to push the feeling away, you might think, interesting. My body is reacting to what it sees in the exact way it was designed. 2. This is a natural biological process. The feeling will come, be there for a while, and then go away. I don't need to do anything about it. except watch it. Now, this might sound cold or robotic, but the Stoics found something amazing. When you stop fighting your desires or being controlled by them, you actually become more open to real connection and pleasure. It's like the difference between being stuck in a strong ocean current and learning to swim with it. Seneca, another great Stoic thinker and an advisor to emperors, said it this way: every new thing excites the mind, but a mind that looks for truth turns from the new to the timeless. When it came to sex, this meant that always chasing new pleasures or being driven by desires you haven't thought about actually stopped you from feeling deeper happiness. But here's where the Stoic way gets really practical and surprisingly modern. They weren't calling for no sex or no emotions. Seneca was married and wrote beautifully about love and partnership. Marcus Aurelius clearly had a loving relationship with his wife. These men understood that close relationships could be part of a good life. He just approached them with a kind of wise calm. Think of it this way. Have you ever noticed how badly wanting something can actually make it less fun when you get it? Or how being worried about sexual performance can get in the way of real pleasure? The Stoics understood this puzzle thousands of years before modern psychology gave it names like performance anxiety and hedonic adaptation. Their solution was what they called preferred indifference. These are things that are naturally nice and can be enjoyed, but that don't decide your basic well-being. Physical pleasure, including sex, was in this group. It was fine to enjoy it when it came naturally, but desperately looking for it or making your happiness depend on it was a sure way to suffer. Marcus Aurelius showed this idea in his own life in ways that might surprise you. Even though he was emperor and could have any pleasure he wanted, he chose to live a fairly simple life. But this wasn't about being strict for no reason. It was a strategy. By not depending on outside pleasures for his happiness, he kept the freedom to enjoy them when it was right, without being a slave to them. Here's a practical example from his journal. When you wake up, tell yourself, the people I meet today will be meddling, ungrateful, proud, dishonest, jealous, and rude. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and I know that the person who does wrong has a nature like my own. Notice how he's getting his mind ready to act wisely instead of just reacting. The Stoics used this same idea for desire. Before going into any situation where strong desires might come up, whether sexual, social, or for things they would remind themselves of their values and what they intended to do. This wasn't about pushing down natural feelings, but about staying clear-headed enough to choose how to act instead of being driven by impulse. Epictetus taught a specific exercise for this. He called it the view from above, imagining yourself from the universe's point of view, seeing your desires and worries in a huge context. When you're feeling overwhelmed by sexual frustration or romantic obsession, you might stop and think, in the vastness of space and time, this feeling is one short moment in one human life on one small planet. It's natural and normal, but it's not the center of the universe. This isn't meant to make human connection or pleasure seem unimportant, but to put them in perspective. The Stoics found that this big-picture view actually made them appreciate real closeness more because it freed them from the worry and desperation that often get in the way of connection. But maybe the most groundbreaking part of Stoic sexual ethics was their focus on being good within relationships. They believed that how you treated sexual partners was a direct sign of your character. Seneca wrote a lot about the importance of treating everyone, including slaves and sex workers, with dignity and respect. This was a radical idea in a culture where using people for sex was common. Marcus Aurelius took this even further, arguing that true pleasure could only be found in relationships based on mutual respect and real care. In his view, using another person just for physical satisfaction was not only morally wrong, but, in the end, not satisfying because it ignored the deeper human need for connection and meaning. The Stoics also developed what might be the first organized approach to what we now call mindful sexuality. They practiced paying full attention to physical experiences without the extra layers of fantasy, worry, or pressure to perform. This meant being completely there with your partner and with your own feelings, instead of being lost in thoughts about past or future experiences. Interestingly, this approach often led to more, not fewer, satisfying sexual experiences. When you're not always judging your performance or comparing your experience to some perfect idea, you can actually be present to what's happening. When you're not desperately looking for pleasure or afraid of losing it, you can relax into real closeness. What's fascinating is how closely these old ideas match modern therapy methods. Mindfulness-based therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and even some kinds of sex therapy use principles that the Stoics created 2,000 years ago. The idea that fighting against your desires creates more suffering than the desires themselves. That's straight from Marcus Aurelius's playbook. But the Stoics weren't the only old thinkers who thought outside the box when it came to sex and spiritual growth. While they were creating their disciplined approach to desire in the fancy halls of Roman palaces, there was another thinker whose ideas about pleasure were so misunderstood that his name became a word for over-the-top pleasure-seeking. Have you ever tried the Stoic approach to desire, just watching your feelings without acting on them or judging them right away? What do you think would happen if more people practiced this kind of mindful awareness in their relationships? In our next part, we're going to meet Epicurus, a man whose actual teachings about pleasure and sex were so different from what people think. They were that it might completely change how you understand the link between enjoyment and wisdom, and his surprising advice about when to avoid sexual pleasure completely. It's going to challenge everything you think you know about ancient pleasure-seeking. Here's what might blow your mind. The philosopher whose name became linked with wild parties and endless pleasure actually told people to avoid sex most of the time. Meet Epicurus, a man so misunderstood that for over 2,000 years, people have used his name to justify the exact opposite of what he actually taught. And his real philosophy about pleasure and sex. It's going to challenge every idea you have about what it means to look for happiness. It's 306 BC. And you're walking into a place that shocked old Athens, the Garden of Epicurus. Unlike other schools of thought that were basically men's clubs, this garden welcomed everyone: men, women, slaves, foreigners. People whispered that it was basically a fancy brothel where thinkers used big words to excuse their pleasure-seeking lifestyle. But if you went inside, you'd find something totally different. The first thing you'd notice is how quiet it is. Instead of wild parties, you'd find people having quiet talks, growing vegetables, reading poetry, and doing what looked like meditation. Instead of fancy feasts, you'd see simple meals shared with friends. And instead of sexual excess, you'd find Epicurus himself, a man who didn't have sex for most of his life and told his followers to be very careful with physical pleasure. So, how did the philosopher of simple pleasures become the face of fancy pleasure-seeking? The answer shows one of history's biggest misunderstandings and gives us ideas about pleasure that might completely change how you think about happiness. Epicurus was born in 341 BC on an island during some of the most chaotic times in Greek history. Alexander the Great had just died. His empire was falling apart, and old Greek values were disappearing. People were looking for meaning in a world that seemed to have lost its way. Sound familiar? Into this confusion, Epicurus offered a way of thinking that was both radical and practical. The goal of life is pleasure. Pand. This is where everyone gets it wrong. He defined pleasure in a way that would shock most people today. According to Epicurus, true pleasure isn't having enjoyable feelings. It's not having pain and worry. He called this state ataraxia, which means something like unshakable calm. And here's the revolutionary part. He found that chasing intense pleasures, including sexual ones, often created more worry and pain than they fixed. Let me share one of Epicurus's most famous pieces of advice about sexuality, and get ready to be surprised. He wrote, "Sexual intercourse has never done anyone any good, and it is lucky if it has not done harm." Now, before you dismiss him as a repressed old man, understand what he was really saying. Epicurus wasn't against sexuality because it was immoral or bad. Those ideas weren't part of his thinking. He was making a purely practical point. For most people, sexual desire creates more suffering than satisfaction. The waiting, the chasing, the jealousy, the heartbreak, the social problems, all of these, he argued, usually outweighed the short moments of physical pleasure. But this is where Epicurus's genius comes out. He wasn't making a rule for everyone. He was teaching people how to figure out if any particular pleasure was worth going after. He created what might be the first organized cost-benefit analysis for human desires. Imagine Epicurus sitting with a student who's torn up about whether to go after someone they're attracted to. Instead of giving moral advice, Epicurus would ask practical questions. Will this chase bring you peace or worry? Will it make you more free or create dependencies? Will it make your friendships stronger or cause social drama? Will the pleasure last longer than the pain it might cause? This wasn't about being anti-pleasure. It was about being smart about pleasure. Epicurus separated what he called kinetic pleasures and katastematic pleasures. Kinetic pleasures are strong but short, like sexual climax, the thrill of winning, or the high from drugs. Katastematic pleasures are quiet but long-lasting, like the deep happiness of friendship, the quiet joy of a beautiful sunset, or the peace of a clear conscience. Here's the fascinating part. Epicurus noticed that people who chased kinetic pleasures often became less able to enjoy katastematic pleasures. It's like how eating lots of sugar makes vegetables taste boring, or how constant noise makes quiet moments feel dull. Sexual obsession, he noticed, often made people less able to enjoy the deeper pleasures of friendship, smart conversation, and inner peace. But Epicurus wasn't pushing for everyone to be celibate. He knew that some people could have sexual relationships without being controlled by them. The key was what he called prudence, the ability to choose pleasures wisely instead of being driven by impulse. Let me tell you about one of Epicurus's most famous students, Lucretius, who lived about 200 years later and wrote a beautiful poem called On the Nature of Things. Lucretius took his teacher's ideas about sexuality and turned them into what might be the first psychological look at romantic obsession. Lucretius described what happens when someone becomes sexually fixated on another person. The lovers, even while they are making love, cannot satisfy their passion by looking at each other's body, nor can they rub away anything from the soft limbs they touch with their hands as they wander unsure over the whole body. He's describing something we might now call anxious attachment, the way desperate desire can make even physical closeness feel unsatisfying. The solution, according to both Epicurus and Lucretius, wasn't to avoid all sexual experience, but to approach it with what they called ataraxic awareness, the ability to enjoy pleasure without being controlled by the need for it. This is very similar to what modern mindfulness teachers call non-attached enjoyment. Here's a practical example of how this might work. You're attracted to someone, and instead of immediately going after them or pushing the feeling down, you stop and ask Epicurean questions. Is this attraction based on real compatibility or just fantasy? Will going after this make my mind more peaceful or create worry? Am I looking for connection or just trying to fill an emotional hole? Can I enjoy the feeling of attraction itself without having to act on it? Epicurus taught that this kind of self-reflection often showed that what we think is sexual desire is actually something else. Loneliness, boredom, the need to feel good about ourselves, or an escape from difficult feelings, and dealing with These deeper needs directly, he found, was usually more satisfying than trying to fix them through sexual pursuit. But maybe Epicurus's most radical idea was about the link between pleasure and freedom. He noticed that people who became dependent on any outside source of pleasure, whether sexual, material, or social, slowly lost their ability for inner happiness. They became what he called slaves to their desires, always subject to things they couldn't control. This is why Epicurus chose to live simply and avoid sexual complications. Not because he thought pleasure was bad, but because he valued freedom more than any one pleasure. He wanted to be able to enjoy good things when they happened without needing them to be happy. The Garden of Epicurus was designed as an experiment in this kind of freedom. People lived together in friendship instead of romantic pairs, shared what they had instead of competing for it, and found pleasure in simple things instead of intense experiences. It wasn't anti-pleasure. It was pro-sustainable pleasure. What's remarkable is how much modern research supports many of Epicurus's observations. Studies show that people who base their happiness on outside achievements or pleasures are less satisfied with life than those who find happiness in relationships, meaning, and inner peace. Research on hedonic adaptation confirms that intense pleasures quickly lose their effect, while simple pleasures stay satisfying over time. Even more interesting, studies of sexual satisfaction show that people who approach intimacy with mindfulness and low anxiety feel more pleasure than those who are focused on goals or performance. It's as if Epicurus discovered principles about pleasure that modern psychology is only now proving with science. But here's where Epicurus's approach becomes really practical for modern relationships. He taught that the best sexual experiences happen when you're not desperately looking for them. When you're happy with yourself and your life. When you're not using sex to fill emotional gaps or prove something about yourself, you can actually be present for real connection and pleasure. This doesn't mean being passive or uninterested. It means approaching intimacy from a place of having enough. Rather than needing something, curiosity rather than desperation, and appreciation rather than being attached to specific results. Epicurus also had fascinating ideas about the difference between natural desires and what he called vain desires. Natural desires, like the need for food, shelter, and friendship, can be satisfied pretty easily. Vain desires, like the need to be the most attractive person in the room or to have more sexual partners than your friends, can never be satisfied because they're based on comparison and ego rather than real needs. He noticed that much of what people call sexual desire is actually vain desire. The need to prove you're attractive, to boost your self-esteem, or to compete with others. And chasing these vain desires, he found, actually got in the way of enjoying real physical and emotional closeness. Now, I'm curious about your experience with this. Have you ever noticed how desperately wanting something can make it less enjoyable when you get it? Or how some of your most satisfying experiences happened when you weren't actively looking for pleasure? The wisdom we've been exploring, from Plato's spiritual ladder to Aristotle's golden mean to the Stoics' mindful distance to Epicurus's smart pleasure, all points to a similar idea. The relationship between desire and satisfaction is much more complicated than it seems. But we're about to meet a group of thinkers who took this complexity to an extreme that shocked even the open-minded Greeks. Coming up, we'll meet the Cynics. Old philosophers who believed that social rules around sexuality were not just unnecessary, but actually bad for people's well-being. And their radical experiments in sexual freedom were so controversial that they influenced arguments about morality that are still going on today. There's a story that ancient Athenians told about Diogenes that would make a modern social media scandal seem mild. One sunny afternoon in the Agora, the busy marketplace that was the center of Athenian society, this wild-haired philosopher was seen doing what we'll politely call self-pleasure right there in public. Surrounded by shocked, shopkeepers, and scandalized citizens. When someone confronted him about this shocking behavior, Diogenes calmly said, "If only I could satisfy my hunger by rubbing my stomach the same way." This wasn't just showing off or mental illness. This was philosophy in action. Diogenes belonged to a school called the Cynics, and their approach to sexuality was so radical that it challenged every idea ancient society had about proper behavior, social roles, and human nature itself. And their main idea about sexual shame and social training is more relevant today than ever. Welcome to the world's first counterculture movement, where philosophers lived like homeless people by choice, rejected all social rules, and did experiments in sexual freedom that would make the 1960s look tame. But before you write them off as ancient hippies, think about this. Their ideas about being real, living naturally, and sexual freedom influenced everyone from early Christians to modern anarchists. Diogenes was born around 412 BC in a Greek town on the Black Sea. His father was a banker who was caught faking money. The scandal ruined the family's name and forced Diogenes to leave. But instead of being crushed by this loss of respectability, Diogenes had a revelation. What if social respectability itself was the real fake money? This thought led him to Athens, where he became the student of a philosopher who had studied with Socrates but came to very different conclusions. While other Socratic schools focused on right and wrong and knowledge, this teacher asked a more basic question. What if most human suffering comes from trying to live up to fake social expectations? The Cynics, and yes, they got their name from the Greek word for dog because people said they lived like animals developed. It's a philosophy that was stunningly simple. Live according to nature. Reject social rules and seek goodness through radical honesty. And when it came to sexuality, this meant questioning everything that civilized society took for granted. Let me give you a picture of what Cynic sexual philosophy looked like in practice. Diogenes owned nothing but a cloak, a walking stick, and a food bag. He slept wherever he could find shelter, often in a large ceramic jar in the marketplace. He had no long-term relationships, no property to protect, no reputation to keep up. This wasn't being poor. This was being free. From this position of complete social detachment, Diogenes watched human sexual behavior with the clarity of a scientist, studying a strange culture. And what he saw horrified him. People torturing themselves with shame, jealousy, and fake desires that had nothing to do with natural human needs. The Greeks had complex rules about who could have sex with whom, when, where, and how. Men could have multiple partners, but women couldn't. Citizens had different sexual rights than slaves. There were complicated rules for dating, marriage, and affairs. The Cynics looked at all this and asked, where do these rules come from? Who do they help? What would happen if we ignored them completely? Diogenes conducted what might be history's first experiments in sexual freedom. He argued that if sexual desire was natural, which it obviously was, then acting on it should be as simple and shameless as eating when hungry or sleeping when tired. The complex social system around sex, he claimed, was just a way for the powerful to control the powerless. But here's where the Cynic approach gets really interesting. They weren't promoting sexual indulgence. They were promoting sexual honesty. Diogenes noticed that people who were always busy with sexual thoughts, romantic fantasies, and complicated dating rituals were actually less sexually satisfied than those who approached their desires simply and directly. Take the story of Diogenes and the prostitute. Unlike other philosophers who either avoided sex workers or used their services while feeling morally better than them, Diogenes treated them as fellow human beings doing honest work. He reportedly said, "A prostitute provides a needed service." With honesty, a married woman often provides the same service while pretending it's something else. This wasn't cynicism in the modern sense. It was brutal honesty about human nature. The Cynics saw that people often used marriage, romance, and social respectability to hide what were basically economic and sexual deals. They thought it was more moral to be direct about these needs rather than hiding them in complicated social lies. Crates of Thebes, another famous Cynic, took these ideas even further. Around 336 BC, he married Hipparchia, a wealthy woman who gave up her comfortable life to join him in philosophical poverty. But their relationship was revolutionary in ways that go far beyond money. First, they treated each other as complete equals, which was unusual in a culture where women had almost no legal rights. Second, they lived their relationship in public, without the privacy that Greek society thought was necessary for respectable people. They ate together in public, slept in public places, and yes, according to old accounts, they made love in public, believing that natural acts shouldn't be hidden away like shameful secrets. Now, before you think this was just ancient showing off, understand the philosophical point they were making. Crates and Hipparchia believed that sexual shame was a form of social control that stopped people from living honestly. By refusing to hide their physical relationship, they were challenging the idea that sexuality was naturally shameful or needed to be hidden. Their public lovemaking wasn't about shocking people. It was about showing that a sexual connection between equals could be as natural and unashamed as any other human activity. They were asking, why should something beautiful and life-giving be treated as if it were dirty or embarrassing? This approach also applied to their views on family and raising children. Unlike other Greeks who saw marriage mainly as a way to have legitimate children for economic reasons, Crates and Hipparchia saw their relationship as a partnership between philosophical equals. When they had children, they raised them without gender-based limits, teaching both sons and daughters the same philosophical ideas and practical skills. The Cynics also challenged sexual double standards in ways that were revolutionary for their time. Diogenes reportedly said, "The gods have sex in public," referring to Greek myths where divine beings coupled freely without shame. If the gods weren't tied to human sexual rules, he asked, why should humans be? But perhaps the most radical part of Cynic sexual philosophy was their approach to desire itself. Unlike the Stoics, who tried to control desire through discipline, or the Epicureans who tried to manage it through careful planning, the Cynics tried to free desire from social training completely. Diogenes taught that most sexual problems came not from having desires, but from having the wrong relationship with desire. People suffered not because they wanted sex, but because they wanted sex with specific people under specific conditions for specific social reasons. If you strip away all the social training, he argued, sexual desire becomes as simple and manageable as hunger or thirst. This led to some shocking conclusions that even liberal Greeks found disturbing. Diogenes supported what we might now call sexual fluidity, the idea that people should be free to express their desires regardless of gender, social status, or traditional relationship structures. He reportedly said, "I wish it were as easy to cure hunger by rubbing the belly," meaning that if sexual satisfaction could be gotten as simply as he had shown in the marketplace, people would waste far less time and energy on romantic problems. The Cynics also developed surprisingly modern ideas about sexual authenticity. They noticed that people often perform sexuality rather than experiencing it, trying to live up to social expectations about how men and women should act sexually, instead of finding their own natural responses. Hipparchia especially challenged gender roles that other philosophers took for granted. She refused to be limited to domestic roles, took part equally in philosophical debates, and kept her intellectual independence even in marriage. When critics attacked her for leaving traditional female roles, she reportedly replied, "Do you think I have made a wrong decision if I spend the time I would have spent weaving on my education?" What's fascinating is how closely some Cynic ideas match modern research on sexual well-being. Studies consistently show that people who feel shame about their sexual desires have lower satisfaction and more sexual problems than those who accept their desires without judgment. Research on sexual authenticity suggests that people who can express their real preferences, rather than performing expected roles, experience more pleasure and better relationships. The Cynics were also remarkably ahead of their time in seeing that sexual problems often come from social pressure rather than individual issues. They saw that in cultures with strict sexual rules, people spent huge amounts of energy trying to fit expectations that often went against their natural feelings. But the Cynic way of life had its own issues. By rejecting all social rules, they sometimes acted in ways that hurt other people. Their focus on being true to oneself could turn into being selfish and not caring about the community. And while their public displays of sexuality matched their philosophy, it often pushed away people who might have supported them, which meant their ideas didn't spread as far. Maybe the biggest issue was that the Cynics didn't see the value in some social rules about sex. While many rules are pointless and unfair, others are important. They protect people who are easily hurt, create stable homes for raising children, and help society stick together. Modern relationship experts have found that having some privacy and commitment in a sexual relationship often makes it better, not worse. The total sexual freedom the Cynics wanted, while it sounds good, can sometimes create worry and instability that gets in the way of a deep connection. What do you think of the Cynic way? Do you ever feel like society's rules about sex cause more problems than they fix? Or do you think some of these rules have a good purpose? The conflict between being true to yourself and fitting into society, which the Cynics showed would be talked about in philosophy for hundreds of years. But as we're about to see, this very conflict led to some of the deepest thoughts about sex and spirituality that the ancient world ever had. Our journey now takes us east, where completely different ways of thinking were dealing with similar questions about desire, social rules, and living a good life. We're about to see how ancient Chinese thinkers handled these timeless problems. And their answers might surprise you with how practical and smart they are. Thousands of miles from the marble buildings of Athens in the foggy mountains of old China, two great thinkers were creating completely different answers to the same old questions about desire, balance, and what it means to be human. But what's really amazing is this. While Western thinkers argued about whether to rise above sexuality or fully embrace it, these Eastern wise men made systems so advanced that they're still shaping modern relationship counseling and sexual health practices today. Let me take you to around 500 BC, to a world where philosophy wasn't just thinking about ideas, but practical advice for living. You're about to find out how Confucius and Laozi, to men who probably never met, but whose ideas would affect billions of people, thought about sexuality in ways that might completely change how you see relationships, desire, and being human. First, let's go to the court of Lu, where a man named Kong-Q, later known as Confucius, is working for the government. It's around 501 BC, and you're watching one of history's most important thinkers deal with a very personal problem. Confucius has just turned 50, and his wife has died. By custom, he should marry again soon to take care of his home and have more children. But Confucius makes a choice that shocks everyone. He decides to stay single for the rest of his life. Now, this wasn't because Confucius thought sex was a sin or shameful. Those ideas didn't exist in ancient Chinese thinking. Instead, his choice showed a deep understanding of how sexual energy connects to what the Chinese called growing in goodness and keeping society in balance. Confucius taught that everything in human life should serve what he called Ren, which is often translated as goodness or humanity, but really means something like becoming a full person through good relationships. And he noticed that sexuality, while natural and needed, could either help this growth or get in the way of it, depending on how it was handled. In the Confucian system, sexual relationships weren't just personal things. They were the basis of social order. The relationship between a husband and wife was seen as a small version of all other relationships: ruler and subject, parent and child, teacher and student. How you treated your sexual partner, according to Confucius, showed your character and affected your ability to keep harmony in every other part of your life. But here's where Confucian ideas about sex become really practical and surprisingly modern. Confucius taught that sexual relationships should be based on what he called li, which means proper ceremony or right behavior. This wasn't about strict rules, but about respecting each other, being considerate, and understanding each other's needs and limits. The Analects, a book of his sayings, records Confucius saying, "The good person understands what is right. The small person understands what is profitable." When applied to sex, this meant that approaching close relationships with real care for your partner's well-being was totally different from using relationships for your own pleasure, to improve your social standing, or for money. Confucian sexual ideas emphasized what we might now call emotional smarts in relationships. The ideal person, according to Confucius, could understand their partner's feelings, respond to their needs in the right way, and keep things peaceful even during arguments, or when things were disappointing. Sexual closeness was seen as one way of showing this deeper emotional connection. But maybe the most groundbreaking Confucian idea was that sexual relationships were ways to develop your character. Confucius taught that learning to love another person well with patience, kindness, and real concern for their growth was basically the same skill needed to be a good citizen, a wise leader, and a good human being. Here's a clear example of how this worked. Confucian writings describe the ideal sexual relationship as one where both partners are always learning from each other. The husband learns to be gentle and sensitive by paying attention to his wife's needs. The wife learns to be strong and decisive by supporting her husband's duties. Both develop what Confucians called zhang and shou loyalty, and give and take through the daily practice of putting their partner's needs alongside their own. Now, while Confucius was creating his system of moral relationships in the royal courts, a very different kind of wisdom was coming from the mystical traditions of ancient China. Enter Laozi, the legendary founder of Taoism. His approach to sexuality was so different from Confucian ideas that it created a philosophical conflict that still affects Eastern thinking today. Laozi, whose name literally means old master and who might have been a legendary figure rather than a real person, taught that the basic principle of life was the Tao, often translated as the way, but really meaning something like the natural flow of the universe. And according to Taoist philosophy, sexuality wasn't just a human activity. It was a direct part of the cosmic forces that create and keep all life going. The Tao Te Ching, the main book of Taoism, has some of the most beautiful and mysterious writings about sexuality ever. Chapter 6 describes the valley spirit, the female, receptive force that gives birth to everything. The valley spirit never dies. It is the woman, primal mother. Her gateway is the root of heaven and earth. It is like a veil, barely seen. Use it, it will never fail. This wasn't just a poetic image. It was the basis for a deep understanding of sexual energy as a small version of the universe's creative force. Taoists created practices that treated sexual union as a form of meditation, a way of matching human energy with cosmic energy, and a path toward what they called immortality, not living forever in a literal sense, but a state of mind so in tune with the natural flow that death didn't matter. But here's where Taoist sexual philosophy gets really practical and surprisingly useful for modern relationships. Taoists found that sexual energy could be grown, improved, and guided in ways that improve both physical health and spiritual growth. They developed what might be the world's first complete system of sexual wellness, with breathing exercises, movement practices, and ways of being intimate that increased both pleasure and long life. The Taoist idea of Da, often translated as vital essence, was key to their understanding of sexuality. Jing was seen as the basic life force that powered everything from physical health to clear thinking to spiritual understanding. And sexual activity, according to Taoists, was one of the most powerful ways to either increase or use up this vital essence, depending on how it was done. Unlike Western traditions that often saw sexuality as draining spiritual energy, Taoists developed techniques for sexual practice that actually increased rather than used up life force. These practices, known together as the bedroom arts, included specific ways of getting aroused, breathing, moving, and even having an orgasm that were designed to move sexual energy through the body rather than just releasing it. Here's a specific example that shows how advanced Taoist sexual practice became. The ancient text Su Nu Jing, or Classic of the Plain Girl, describes a conversation between the Yellow Emperor and Su Nu, a goddess figure who teaches sexual cultivation. Su Nu explains that sexual union should follow the natural rhythms of arousal and response, with both partners learning to ride the waves of sexual energy rather than rushing to the end. The text describes techniques for what we might now call extended arousal, keeping high levels of sexual excitement for a long time without immediate release. This wasn't about sexual frustration or denial, but about finding that the journey of arousal could be more satisfying than the destination of orgasm. Modern research on sexual satisfaction has confirmed that couples who focus on the whole experience of intimacy, rather than just genital stimulation, report higher levels of pleasure and relationship happiness. But perhaps the most amazing part of Taoist sexual philosophy was how it combined physical pleasure with spiritual growth. Taoists taught that sexual union could be a form of moving meditation, a practice of wu wei, or effortless action in tune with the natural flow. During intimate moments, partners were encouraged to let go of goal-oriented thinking and give into the natural rhythms of their bodies and emotions. This created what Taoists called valley orgasm, a state of long-lasting bliss that could last for hours and left both partners feeling energized rather than tired. Unlike peak orgasms that involved a strong buildup and sudden release, valley orgasms were described as gentle waves of pleasure that connected partners not just physically, but with their energy and spirits. The difference between Confucian and Taoist approaches to sexuality shows a basic conflict that still affects how we think about relationships today. Confucians focused on moral responsibility, social harmony, and growing in goodness through relationships. Taoists focused on natural flow, energy balance, and growing life force through sexual practice. But here's what's fascinating. These weren't necessarily opposing approaches. Many Chinese thinkers found ways to combine Confucian ethics with Taoist practices, creating relationships that were both socially responsible and spiritually fulfilling, both morally solid and full of energy. For example, a person influenced by Confucius might approach their sexual relationship with deep respect for their partner's well-being and a commitment to growing and supporting each other. But they might also use Taoist practices like breathing together, extended arousal, and moving energy to increase both pleasure and spiritual connection. This combination created what might be the most psychologically advanced approach to sexuality in the ancient world. It combined Western concerns about goodness and character with Eastern insights about energy and natural flow. It honored both the social parts of sexual relationships and their deeply personal, even mystical aspects. Modern relationship research has found that the most satisfied couples tend to combine exactly these things: a moral commitment to each other's well-being, practical skills for keeping emotional and physical closeness, and ways of approaching sexuality that add to rather than take away from their overall life energy. Have you ever felt the difference between goal-focused sexuality and what Taoists might call Wu-wei sexuality, intimate connection that flows naturally without forcing certain results. What do you think about the idea that sexual practices could actually increase rather than use up your overall energy and well-being? The wisdom we found in Chinese philosophy, while Confucian focus on moral relationships, and the Taoist understanding of sexual energy as a spiritual practice, is just one part of ancient wisdom about the connection between sexuality and living a good life. But as our journey continues, we're about to see a perspective that challenged all previous ideas about desire, attachment, and the nature of human suffering itself. We're heading next into the deep teachings of Buddhism, where a prince who gave up everything, including his wife and child, to find enlightenment, discovered truths about desire that would influence billions of people and offer ideas about sexuality that modern psychology is only now starting to understand. Deep in the forests of northern India, around 530 BC, a 29-year-old prince named Siddhartha sits by a river, looking at his reflection in the water. Just hours before, he had everything a man could want: a beautiful wife named Yashodhara, a new baby son, endless wealth, and pleasures beyond imagination. But now, in one of history's most shocking choices, he has left it all, including his family, to become a wandering monk, looking for answers to human suffering. What he found out about desire and attachment would change how billions of people understand the link between sexuality and spiritual awakening. This is the story of how the Buddha's insights into human craving created one of the most profound and debated approaches to sexuality ever, and his conclusions about why being attached to any pleasure, including sexual pleasure, causes suffering, are going to challenge everything you think you know about love, desire, and what it means to be happy. Imagine the scene. Prince Siddhartha has lived in 3 palaces built by his father to protect him from knowing about any suffering. His days are filled with music, great food, beautiful companions, and every sensual pleasure you can think of. His father, afraid a prophecy that his son would become a spiritual teacher instead of a king, has created what was basically an ancient pleasure palace designed to keep Siddhartha distracted with constant satisfaction. But here's what makes this story so psychologically interesting. Siddhartha's awakening doesn't come from experiencing suffering himself. It comes from realizing that even endless pleasure leaves something important unfulfilled. Despite having the most beautiful women in the kingdom, the best foods, the most luxurious surroundings, he feels a constant emptiness that no amount of pleasure can fill. The turning point comes when Siddhartha goes outside the palace walls and sees what Buddhists call the 4 sights: an old man, a sick person, a dead body, and a monk. Suddenly, he realizes that everything he's been enjoying, including his sexual relationship with his wife, is temporary, fragile, and will eventually be lost to aging, sickness, and death. But the Buddha's insight goes deeper than just realizing things don't last. He discovers something about the nature of desire itself that would influence psychology for thousands of years. The problem isn't that we want things, it's that we hold on to them. It's not desire that causes suffering. It's being attached to desire. This difference is very important when we understand the Buddha's approach to sexuality. Unlike some later Buddhist traditions that pushed for celibacy, the Buddha's original teaching was more subtle. He taught what he called the middle way, avoiding both extreme pleasure-seeking and extreme self-denial. This meant that sexuality itself wasn't the problem, but our relationship with sexuality could become a source of suffering if we approached it with what he called tanha, which literally means thirst or desperate craving. Let me share one of the Buddha's deepest insights about sexual desire. Found in a book called the Dhammapada, from attachment comes grief. From attachment comes fear. For one who is completely free from attachment, there is no grief and no fear. When applied to sexuality, this doesn't mean avoiding all sexual experience, but learning to enjoy intimate connection without being a slave to the need for it. Here's how this works in a practical sense. The Buddha saw that people suffer not because they have sexual desires, but because they become identified with those desires. They start believing thoughts like, I must have this person, or I can't be happy without sexual fulfillment, or my value depends on being sexually attractive. These thoughts, according to the Buddha, create what he called dukkha, the basic dissatisfaction that is part of most human experience. The Buddha's analysis of sexual craving was remarkably advanced for his time and predicted many ideas of modern psychology. He identified what we might now call sexual fantasy addiction, the way people become obsessed with imagined sexual situations that stop them from being present in real, intimate experiences. He also recognized what modern therapists call sexual performance anxiety, the way that desperately wanting sexual experiences to go a certain way often gets in the way of a natural sexual response. The first noble truth teaches that suffering is a part of human life. The second noble truth explains that this suffering comes from tanha, the constant thirst for things to be different than they are. When applied to sexuality, this means that a lot of sexual frustration comes not from a lack of sexual experience, but from wanting sexual experiences to be different, better, more frequent, or more intense than they naturally are. The Buddha taught his followers to practice what he called mindful awareness of their desires, watching sexual thoughts and feelings without immediately acting on them or judging them as good or bad. This wasn't sexual repression, but sexual wisdom. By learning to watch desires come and go without being controlled by them, people could make clearer choices about when and how to act on sexual urges. Here's a specific technique the Buddha taught that's very similar to modern mindfulness-based sex therapy. When you feel sexual desire, instead of immediately trying to satisfy it or pushing the feeling away, just watch it. Notice the physical sensations, the thoughts that come up, the emotions that go with the desire. Watch how the feeling changes over time, how it builds, peaks, and eventually fades away on its own. The Buddha found that most sexual craving is actually made stronger by our resistance to it or our desperate chase of it. When we try to push down sexual thoughts, they often become more powerful. When we chase sexual satisfaction desperately, we often find it less satisfying than we hoped. But when we just watch sexual desire with calm awareness, it becomes much easier to handle, and our choices about how to respond become clearer. The third noble truth offers hope. It's possible to be free from the suffering caused by attachment to sexual desires. This doesn't mean becoming sexually numb or inactive, but developing what the Buddha called uppannanirada, the end of clinging. You can enjoy sexual experiences when they happen naturally without needing them for your happiness or defining yourself by them. The Buddha's own life is an example of this middle way. After his first period of extreme self-denial, during which he nearly starved himself to death trying to get past all bodily desires, he realized that punishing the body doesn't lead to spiritual freedom. He started eating again, and according to some stories, he had loving relationships throughout his life, though these were marked by non-attachment rather than possessive desire. The fourth noble truth describes the Eightfold Path, a practical program for developing the wisdom and good behavior that leads to freedom from suffering. When applied to sexuality, this path includes right speech, honest communication with sexual partners, right actions, sexual behavior that doesn't harm yourself or others, and right mindfulness, being aware of the present moment during intimate experiences. But perhaps the Buddha's most revolutionary insight was about the relationship between sexual satisfaction and spiritual growth. He saw that people who were always busy with sexual desires, there chasing them or fighting them, had little mental energy left for developing compassion, wisdom, and inner peace. But people who found a balanced relationship with sexuality often found that their spiritual practice got deeper, and their ability for loving kindness grew. This led to what might be Buddhism's most practical contribution to sexual wisdom, the understanding that sexual fulfillment and spiritual growth can support each other when handled skillfully. Sexual experiences that are marked by mindfulness, mutual respect, and non-attachment can actually improve rather than get in the way of spiritual development. For example, Buddhist texts describe how intimate physical connection can become a form of meditation when both partners are fully present, free from performance anxiety and focused on giving rather than getting pleasure. This kind of mindful sexuality often leads to deeper satisfaction than goal-focused sexual experiences because it removes the pressure and expectation that get in the way of a natural response. The Buddha also had deep insights about the difference between love and attachment that are key for understanding healthy sexuality. He taught that real love, what he called metta, means wanting someone to be happy and free from suffering, whether or not they satisfy your desires. Attachment, on the other hand, means wanting someone to make you happy and meet your needs. When applied to sexual relationships, this means that healthy, intimate connections are based on mutual care and real affection rather than need and possession. When you approach sexuality from love rather than attachment, you can enjoy physical intimacy without becoming jealous, possessive, or dependent on your partner for your emotional well-being. Modern research on relationship satisfaction has confirmed many of the Buddha's insights. Studies show that people who approach sexuality with mindfulness and low attachment report higher levels of sexual satisfaction than those who are goal-oriented or anxious about performance. Research on meditation and sexual function suggests that mindfulness practices can actually improve sexual response by reducing anxiety and increasing present moment awareness. Neuroscience research has also confirmed the Buddha's observations about desire and satisfaction. Brain imaging studies show that the thought of pleasure often activates reward centers more strongly than the actual experience of pleasure. This supports the Buddha's insight that much of what we call sexual desire is actually mental fantasy that stops us from fully experiencing real, intimate connection. But the Buddha's approach to sexuality had its challenges. His focus on non-attachment could sometimes be misunderstood as being emotionally cold or lacking passion. Some Buddhist communities developed such strict rules about celibacy that they lost touch with the middle way that the Buddha originally taught. And the idea of non-attachment could be used to justify avoiding the emotional vulnerability that deep, intimate relationships need. The turning point comes when Siddhartha goes outside the palace walls and sees what Buddhists call the four sights: an old man, a sick person, a dead body, and a monk. Suddenly, he realizes that everything he's been enjoying, including his sexual relationship with his wife, is temporary, fragile, and will eventually be lost to aging, sickness, and death. But the Buddha's insight goes deeper than just realizing things don't last. He discovers something about the nature of desire itself that would influence psychology for thousands of years. The problem isn't that we want things, it's that we hold on to them. It's not desire that causes suffering. It's being attached to desire. This difference is very important when we understand the Buddha's approach to sexuality. Unlike some later Buddhist traditions that pushed for celibacy, the Buddha's original teaching was more subtle. He taught what he called the middle way, avoiding both extreme pleasure-seeking and extreme self-denial. This meant that sexuality itself wasn't the problem, but our relationship with sexuality could become a source of suffering if we approached it with what he called tanha, which literally means thirst or desperate craving. Let me share one of the Buddha's deepest insights about sexual desire. Found in a book called the Dhammapada, From Attachment Comes Grief. From attachment comes fear. For one who is completely free from attachment, there is no grief and no fear. When applied to sexuality, this doesn't mean avoiding all sexual experience. but learning to enjoy intimate connection without being a slave to the need for it. Here's how this works in a practical sense. The Buddha saw that people suffer not because they have sexual desires, but because they become identified with those desires. They start believing thoughts like, I must have this person, or I can't be happy without sexual fulfillment, or my value depends on being sexually attractive. These thoughts, according to the Buddha, create what he called dukkha, the basic dissatisfaction that is part of most human experience. The Buddha's analysis of sexual craving was remarkably advanced for his time and predicted many ideas of modern psychology. He identified what we might now call sexual fantasy addiction, the way people become obsessed with imagined sexual situations that stop them from being present in real, intimate experiences. He also recognized what modern therapists call sexual performance anxiety, the way that desperately wanting sexual experiences to go a certain way often gets in the way of a natural sexual response. The first noble truth teaches that suffering is a part of human life. The second noble truth explains that this suffering comes from tanha, the constant thirst for things to be different than they are. When applied to sexuality, this means that a lot of sexual frustration comes not from a lack of sexual experience, but from wanting sexual experiences to be different, better, more frequent, or more intense than they naturally are. The Buddha taught his followers to practice what he called mindful awareness of their desires, watching sexual thoughts and feelings without immediately acting on them or judging them as good or bad. This wasn't sexual repression, but sexual wisdom. By learning to watch desires come and go without being controlled by them, people could make clearer choices about when and how to act on sexual urges. Here's a specific technique the Buddha taught that's very similar to modern mindfulness-based sex therapy. When you feel sexual desire, instead of immediately trying to satisfy it or pushing the feeling away, just watch it. Notice the physical sensations, the thoughts that come up, the emotions that go with the desire. Watch how the feeling changes over time, how it builds, peaks, and eventually fades away on its own. The Buddha found that most sexual craving is actually made stronger by our resistance to it or our desperate chase of it. When we try to push down sexual thoughts, they often become more powerful. When we chase sexual satisfaction desperately, we often find it less satisfying than we hoped. But when we just watch sexual desire with calm awareness, it becomes much easier to handle, and our choices about how to respond become clearer. The third noble truth offers hope. It's possible to be free from the suffering caused by attachment to sexual desires. This doesn't mean becoming sexually numb or inactive, but developing what the Buddha called uppannanirada, the end of clinging. You can enjoy sexual experiences when they happen naturally without needing them for your happiness or defining yourself by them. The Buddha's own life is an example of this middle way. After his first period of extreme self-denial, during which he nearly starved himself to death trying to get past all bodily desires, he realized that punishing the body doesn't lead to spiritual freedom. He started eating again, and according to some stories, he had loving relationships throughout his life, though these were marked by non-attachment rather than possessive desire. The fourth noble truth describes the Eightfold Path, a practical program for developing the wisdom and good behavior that leads to freedom from suffering. When applied to sexuality, this path includes right speech, honest communication with sexual partners, right actions, sexual behavior that doesn't harm yourself or others, and right mindfulness, being aware of the present moment during intimate experiences. But perhaps the Buddha's most revolutionary insight was about the relationship between sexual satisfaction and spiritual growth. He saw that people who were always busy with sexual desires, there chasing them or fighting them, had little mental energy left for developing compassion, wisdom, and inner peace. But people who found a balanced relationship with sexuality often found that their spiritual practice got deeper, and their ability for loving kindness grew. This led to what might be Buddhism's most practical contribution to sexual wisdom, the understanding that sexual fulfillment and spiritual growth can support each other when handled skillfully. Sexual experiences that are marked by mindfulness, mutual respect, and non-attachment can actually improve rather than get in the way of spiritual development. For example, Buddhist texts describe how intimate physical connection can become a form of meditation when both partners are fully present, free from performance anxiety, and focused on giving rather than getting pleasure. This kind of mindful sexuality often leads to deeper satisfaction than goal-focused sexual experiences because it removes the pressure and expectation that get in the way of a natural response. The Buddha also had deep insights about the difference between love and attachment that are key for understanding healthy sexuality. He taught that real love, what he called metta, means wanting someone to be happy and free from suffering, whether or not they satisfy your desires. Attachment, on the other hand, means wanting someone to make you happy and meet your needs. When applied to sexual relationships, this means that healthy, intimate connections are based on mutual care and real affection, rather than need and possession. When you approach sexuality from love rather than attachment, you can enjoy physical intimacy without becoming jealous, possessive, or dependent on your partner for your emotional well-being. Modern research on relationship satisfaction has confirmed many of the Buddha's insights. Studies show that people who approach sexuality with mindfulness and low attachment report higher levels of sexual satisfaction than those who are goal-oriented or anxious about performance. Research on meditation and sexual function suggests that mindfulness practices can actually improve sexual response by reducing anxiety and increasing present moment awareness. Neuroscience research has also confirmed the Buddha's observations about desire and satisfaction. Brain imaging studies show that the thought of pleasure often activates reward centers more strongly than the actual experience of pleasure. This supports the Buddha's insight that much of what we call sexual desire is actually mental fantasy that stops us from fully experiencing real, intimate connection. But the Buddha's approach to sexuality had its challenges. His focus on non-attachment could sometimes be misunderstood as being emotionally cold or lacking passion. Some Buddhist communities developed such strict rules about celibacy that they lost touch with the middle way that the Buddha originally taught. And the idea of non-attachment could be used to justify avoiding the emotional vulnerability that deep, intimate relationships need. Modern Buddhist teachers have worked to bring back the Buddha's original middle way approach to sexuality, stressing that non-attachment doesn't mean not being involved, but rather being fully involved without being a slave to the results. This has led to the development of what some call sacred sexuality, practices that combine Buddhist mindfulness with tantric approaches to intimate connection. What's your experience with the difference between wanting something desperately and just enjoying it when it's there? Have you ever noticed how worry about sexual performance or relationship outcomes can actually get in the way of the experiences you're looking for? The deep insights we've explored from the Buddha's understanding of desire and attachment to his practical teachings about mindful awareness are just one thread in the rich fabric of ancient wisdom about sexuality and living a good life. But our journey is far from over, and the perspectives we're about to see will take us into even more mysterious places. As we continue exploring how ancient civilizations understood the relationship between sexuality and the sacred, we're about to discover a culture that didn't just think about these connections. They built entire temples around them. Next, we'll journey to ancient Egypt, where the relationship between sexuality and divinity was celebrated in ways that would change how we understand the sacred parts of human intimate connection. Step through the huge stone doorway of the Temple of Hathor at Dendor, and you'll see something that would shock visitors from almost any other ancient civilization. Carved into the sacred walls, lit by flickering torchlight, are clear pictures of gods and goddesses having passionate sex. But this isn't ancient pornography. This is theology. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where sexuality wasn't just allowed by religion, it was seen as essential to the order of the universe itself. You're about to discover how a civilization that built pyramids and mummified pharaohs developed the most advanced understanding of sacred sexuality in the ancient world. And their main myth about sex, death, and resurrection became the model for spiritual traditions that still influence millions of people today. Let me tell you the story that every Egyptian knew by heart, a tale so powerful that it shaped their understanding of love, death, and eternal life for over 3,000 years. It begins with Isis and Osiris, siblings who were also husband and wife, ruling Egypt in a golden age of peace and prosperity. Isis was the goddess of magic, motherhood, and healing. Osiris was the god of fertility, farming, and the afterlife. Together, they represented the perfect union of male and female divine energy. But their happiness was destroyed by jealousy. Set, Osiris's brother, murdered Osiris in a fit of rage and scattered his body across Egypt in 14 pieces. Isis, heartbroken but determined, searched the whole country until she found every piece of her beloved's body. Using her magical powers, she put Osiris back together. But here's where the story becomes amazing. According to the myth, Isis used her divine sexuality to bring Osiris back to life. She turned herself into a bird, spread her wings over his rebuilt body, and through an act of sacred sexual union, she conceived their son, Horus, and brought Osiris back to a new form of life. This wasn't just a love story. It was a cosmic principle. Sexual union between divine male and female forces was literally the power that defeated death and created new life. This myth became the foundation for the Egyptian understanding of sexuality as a sacred force. Unlike cultures that saw sexual desire as a distraction from spiritual things, Egyptians saw sexuality as one of the most direct ways to take part in divine creative power. Every sexual union between humans was seen as a small version of the cosmic union between Isis and Osiris that kept the universe in order. But here's where Egyptians' sacred sexuality gets really advanced. They didn't just celebrate sexual union. As an idea, they developed complex temple practices that treated sexual energy as a form of spiritual technology for healing, transformation, and connecting with divine consciousness. The Temple of Hathor at Dendora, built around 300 BC, but keeping traditions that were already ancient, was basically a center for what we might now call sacred sexuality education. Hathor, known as the Golden One, was the goddess of love, beauty, music, and sexual pleasure. But she wasn't just about physical satisfaction. She was about the transformative power of sexual ecstasy as a path to spiritual awakening. Archaeological evidence suggests that the temple had rooms specifically designed for sexual healing rituals. These weren't orgies or prostitution, but carefully organized practices where sexual energy was used for healing purposes. People with various physical and emotional problems would come to the temple to take part in rituals that combined sexual stimulation with prayer, meditation, and magical healing techniques. The walls of these temples have some of the most explicit sexual images ever found in a religious setting. But every image has a spiritual purpose. One famous carving shows the god-men with a huge erect phallus receiving offerings from worshippers. This wasn't meant to be shocking or arousing. It was meant to remind people that sexual power was a gift from the gods that should be honored and used wisely. Another set of carvings shows the goddess Isis performing what scholars gently call sexual magic on the mummified Osiris. These images show specific techniques for using sexual energy to heal trauma, restore vitality, and even prepare the mind for the journey through death. Modern tantric practitioners would recognize many of these techniques as similar to their own methods for moving sexual energy through the body. The Egyptians developed what might be the world's first systematic understanding of what we now call energy anatomy in relation to sexuality. They mapped what they called ka, or life force energy, as it moved through the body during sexual arousal and union. They identified specific energy centers that match remarkably well with what Hindu and Buddhist traditions later called chakras. Egyptian texts describe techniques for breathing, movement, and mental focus during sexual union that were designed to increase and direct this life force energy for healing and spiritual growth. The Papyrus of Ani, part of the famous Book of the Dead, has passages that modern scholars see as instructions for using sexual visualization and energy movement to stay conscious during the process of dying. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Egyptian sacred sexuality was how it combined pleasure with spiritual purpose. Unlike traditions that saw spiritual growth as needing to get past physical pleasure, Egyptians saw sexual ecstasy as one of the most direct ways to experience divine consciousness. They had specific words for different levels of sexual spiritual experience, from basic physical pleasure to states of mind that they described as becoming one with the gods. The Instruction of Ptahhotep, one of the oldest Egyptian wisdom texts, has advice about sexual relationships that sounds remarkably modern. If you want your relationships to last, approach sexual union with respect, attention, and real care for your partner's pleasure. Sexual selfishness destroys love, but sexual generosity creates bonds that last beyond death. Egyptian sexual wisdom also emphasized the importance of what they called sexual reciprocity, the idea that both partners should give and receive pleasure equally. This was seen not just as good relationship practice, but as an essential spiritual discipline. The ability to focus on your partner's pleasure while experiencing your own was seen as training for the kind of mind needed to serve the gods and keep cosmic balance. Women held a remarkably high status in Egyptian sexual spirituality. Unlike many ancient cultures where female sexuality was controlled or suppressed, Egyptian traditions celebrated women as the main carriers of sexual magic and healing power. The role of priestess in many temples involved special training in sexual healing techniques, and these women were among the most respected and influential people in Egyptian society. The goddess Hathor was often shown with cow ears and horns, symbols that connected her to the natural fertility of the earth, but also to the gentle, nurturing side of sexual love. Egyptian sexual practices emphasized what they called the way of Hathor's sexual union, marked by tenderness, playfulness, and deep emotional connection rather than aggressive conquest or domination. Egyptian tomb paintings often show couples in an intimate hug in the afterlife, suggesting that they believed sexual love continued after death. This wasn't just a romantic idea. It reflected their understanding that the bond created through conscious sexual union was so deep that it went beyond physical existence. The practice of mummification itself was connected to sexual symbolism. The careful preservation of the body was seen as preparation for reuniting with one's beloved in the afterlife, where sexual union would continue in a perfected form. The opening of the mouth ceremony performed on mummies included parts that scholars recognize as symbolic sexual awakening, the restoration of the ability for both physical pleasure and spiritual connection. Egyptian sexual wisdom included a sophisticated understanding of what we might now call sexual timing and rhythm. They watched natural cycles, moon phases, seasonal changes, farming rhythms, and matched sexual practices with these cosmic patterns. Certain times were considered especially powerful for having children, others for healing, others for purely spiritual connection. The famous Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the earliest medical texts, has detailed anatomical knowledge about sexual response and includes what might be the first recorded sex therapy techniques. Egyptian healers understood that sexual problems were often caused by emotional trauma or spiritual disconnection, not just physical issues, and they developed integrated treatment approaches that addressed body, mind, and spirit together. But Egyptian sacred sexuality wasn't limited to heterosexual relationships. Archaeological evidence suggests that same-sex relationships were also understood within the framework of divine union, especially in certain priestly traditions where sexual polarity was seen as an internal rather than an external dynamic. Modern researchers studying Egyptian sexual practices have been amazed by their psychological sophistication. They understood concepts like sexual communication, consent, aftercare, and the importance of emotional safety in intimate relationships. They recognized that sexual healing often required addressing past trauma and building trust between partners. The influence of Egyptian sacred sexuality spread throughout the ancient world. Greek mystery schools adopted many Egyptian sexual practices. Early Gnostic Christians incorporated Egyptian understanding of sexual symbolism into their spiritual teachings. And many scholars believe that tantric traditions in India were influenced by Egyptian sexual wisdom brought by traders and travelers along ancient routes. What strikes me as most remarkable about Egyptian sexual wisdom is how it smoothly combined physical pleasure with spiritual growth, individual healing with cosmic harmony, and human love with divine love. They didn't see these as separate things that needed to be balanced or chosen between. They saw them as different parts of one unified reality. Have you ever had moments during intimate connection that felt somehow sacred or transcendent? What do you think about the idea that sexual union could be a form of spiritual practice rather than just physical pleasure? The Egyptian understanding of sexuality as a sacred force that connects us to divine creative power represents one of humanity's most advanced attempts to combine body and spirit, pleasure and purpose, human love and cosmic order. But as we continue our journey through ancient wisdom, we're about to see a tradition that took these insights in a completely different direction. Our next exploration leads us into the world of Hebrew wisdom, where sexuality was understood not as a cosmic force or a healing technique, but as something even more radical, a gift from the divine that reflects the very nature of divine love itself. And the most passionate love poetry ever written became part of sacred scripture. Open your Bible to the Song of Solomon, and you'll find something that has shocked readers for thousands of years. 8 chapters of the most sensual, erotic poetry ever included in a sacred book. Listen to these actual verses. Your lips are like a crimson ribbon. Your mouth is lovely. Your temples behind your veil are like the halves of a pomegranate. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with courses of stone. On it hang 1,000 shields, all of them shields of warriors. Your breasts are like 2 fawns, like twin fawns of a gazelle that browse among the lilies. This isn't symbolic language about divine love, though many have tried to see it that way. This is a clear celebration of physical desire, sexual attraction, and erotic pleasure, written by people who believed that sexuality was not just allowed by God, but actually reflected the very nature of divine love itself. Welcome to Hebrew wisdom about sexuality, a perspective so radical that it influenced every major religion that came after it. You're about to discover how a small tribe in the ancient Near East developed an understanding of sexuality that was completely revolutionary for its time, and their insight that sexual love between humans mirrors the passionate love between the divine and creation is going to change how you think about the relationship between the sacred and the sensual. Let me take you back to around 950 BC, to the court of King Solomon in Jerusalem. According to tradition, this wise king, the same Solomon famous for his judgment and his temple, wrote love poetry that was so beautiful and so explicit that it shocked even the sexually open ancient world. But here's what makes the Song of Solomon so amazing. It wasn't written for entertainment or even just for lovers. It was written as theology. The Hebrew understanding of sexuality began with a revolutionary idea found in the very first chapter of Genesis. So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. This simple statement had an insight that would be felt for thousands of years. Sexuality wasn't an accident of evolution or a distraction from spiritual life. It was part of what it meant to be created in the divine image. Unlike cultures that saw sexuality as animal-like, or cultures that saw it as a cosmic force, the Hebrews understood sexuality as fundamentally about relationships. The divine wasn't a single being, but existed in relationship Father, Son, and Spirit, according to later Christian understanding, or the dynamic interaction between divine transcendence and divine presence, according to Jewish mysticism. And human sexuality was seen as the closest humans could come to experiencing this divine relationship quality. The Song of Solomon presents a love relationship between a man and woman that is marked by mutual desire, equal partnership, and unrestrained passion. The woman in the poem is not passive or submissive. She is an active agent of desire who goes after her beloved and celebrates her own sexual power. Listen to her words. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He browses among the lilies, until the day breaks and the shadows flee. Turn, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or like a young stag on the rugged hills. This was revolutionary in the ancient world, where women's sexuality was typically controlled by fathers and husbands, for economic and social reasons. The song presents sexuality as a mutual gift between equals, where both partners give and receive pleasure freely. The Hebrew word used throughout the poem for sexual love is ahava, a term that includes physical attraction, emotional connection, and spiritual communion all at once. But perhaps the most radical part of Hebrew sexual wisdom was how it combined sexuality with covenant love. The relationship between husband and wife was understood as a living symbol of the relationship between God and the people of Israel. This wasn't just a poetic image. Was the foundation for understanding both human love and divine love. The prophet Hosea, writing around 750 BC, used marriage and sexual imagery to describe God's relationship with Israel in ways that were shocking for their intimacy and passion. God is described as a husband who loves his unfaithful wife so deeply that he goes after her even when she leaves him for other lovers. The sexual imagery is explicit and emotionally intense. Therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. This created a completely different understanding of both sexuality and spirituality. Sexual love between humans wasn't a distraction from divine love, it was a participation in divine love. The passion, vulnerability, and ecstasy of human sexual union provided the closest comparison to the passion, vulnerability, and joy of the divine human relationship. Hebrew wisdom also developed sophisticated insights about the psychology of sexual relationships that predict modern understanding of attachment and intimacy. The creation story in Genesis describes the first human as being alone, and God declaring that this aloneness is not good. The solution isn't just companionship, but an ezer kenugdo, a term often translated as helper, but really meaning something like a strength corresponding to him, or a power equal to him. This suggests that a sexual partnership was understood as providing something essential for a good life, not just physical pleasure or social stability, but a kind of psychological and spiritual completeness that comes from intimate connection with another person. The text says that when the man sees the woman, he exclaims, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." It's a cry of recognition, relief, and joy at finding someone who can truly understand and complete him. The Hebrew understanding of sexual union as becoming one flesh wasn't just about physical intimacy, but about creating a new spiritual reality. Marriage was seen as establishing a bond so deep that it literally created a new identity for both partners. This is why divorce was considered so traumatic. It wasn't just the end of a legal agreement, but the tearing apart of a spiritual unity. But Hebrew sexual wisdom went beyond just celebrating marital sexuality. It developed detailed moral guidelines for sexual behavior that were remarkably progressive for their time. The laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that seem strict to modern readers were actually protective, establishing consent, preventing exploitation, and ensuring that sexual relationships served love rather than domination. For example, the requirement that a man who seduced a virgin must marry her and could never divorce her wasn't about punishing the woman. It was about ensuring her economic security in a culture where unmarried women had few options for survival. The ban on adultery protected not just property rights, but the emotional bonds between spouses and the stability of families. The Hebrew Scriptures also have some of the most psychologically advanced insights about sexual desire ever written. The story of David and Bathsheba provides a case study in how sexual attraction can lead to abuse of power, manipulation, and ultimately, tragedy when it's not guided by moral wisdom. David's journey from seeing Bathsheba bathing to committing adultery to arranging her husband's murder shows how unchecked sexual desire can corrupt even the most virtuous people. But the text doesn't conclude that sexual desire itself is evil. Rather, it shows the importance of combining sexuality with justice, compassion, and respect for others. David's sin wasn't in being attracted to Bathsheba, but in using his power to take what wasn't freely given and then trying to cover up the consequences. The wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible has practical advice about sexuality that sounds remarkably modern. Proverbs warns against sexual relationships based on deception, exploitation, or selfish pleasure, while celebrating sexuality within committed, loving relationships. The book describes the ideal wife as someone who brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life, suggesting that the best sexual relationships are those that improve both partners' overall well-being. Hebrew wisdom also understood the connection between sexual health and spiritual health in ways that modern psychology has rediscovered. The Psalms often use images of physical pleasure and satisfaction to describe spiritual fulfillment. Psalm 23 speaks of God preparing a feast and causing the psalmist's cup to overflow. Language that celebrates abundant satisfaction and joy in both physical and spiritual areas. The combination of sexuality and spirituality in Hebrew thought created what might be the healthiest approach to sexual ethics in the ancient world. Unlike cultures that either repressed sexuality or indulged in it without moral thought, Hebrew wisdom sought to honor both the power and the responsibility that comes with sexual intimacy. This approach recognized that sexuality involves the whole person body, emotions, mind, and spirit, and therefore requires wisdom, maturity, and moral commitment. The goal wasn't to minimize sexual pleasure, but to maximize the good life that comes from sexual relationships guided by love, justice, and mutual respect. The Hebrew understanding of sexuality as reflecting divine love also created a unique perspective on sexual problems and healing. Sexual dysfunction wasn't seen as just a physical problem, but as a sign of a broken relationship, either between the partners or between the couple and God. Healing required not just physical help, but rebuilding trust, communication, and spiritual connection. Modern research on sexual satisfaction has confirmed many insights from Hebrew wisdom. Studies consistently show that the most sexually satisfied couples are those who combine physical passion with emotional intimacy, moral commitment, and shared meaning. The Hebrew combination of eros passionate love, philia friendship love, and agape self-sacrificing love within marriage predicts what relationship researchers now call consummate love. The influence of Hebrew sexual wisdom went far beyond Jewish communities. Early Christians built on Hebrew foundations while adding new dimensions of understanding. Islamic tradition also drew heavily on Hebrew insights about sexuality as a divine gift. And modern therapeutic approaches to sexual healing often rediscover principles that were first written down in Hebrew. Wisdom literature. What do you think? About the idea that sexual passion between humans could actually reflect divine passion. Have you ever had moments of intimate connection that felt somehow sacred or transcendent? The Hebrew vision of sexuality as a divine gift that reflects the very nature of divine love represents one of humanity's most advanced attempts to combine physical pleasure with spiritual meaning, passionate desire with moral commitment, and human love with divine love. But as our journey through ancient wisdom continues, we're about to see philosophical developments that would complicate this beautiful combination in ways that still influence how we think about sexuality today. Moving forward, we'll explore how later philosophical schools took the insights we've discovered and developed them into even more complex understandings of the relationship between sexuality and spiritual awakening. Our next stop brings us to the Neoplatonists, where mystical philosophy and sexual symbolism combine to create some of the most profound and mysterious teachings about the soul's journey toward divine union. Alexandria, 250 AD. In a dimly lit study looking out over the ancient harbor, a man sits surrounded by scrolls from every corner of the known world: Greek philosophy, Egyptian mysteries, Hebrew scriptures, Persian wisdom texts. His name is Plotinus, and he's about to combine all of this ancient knowledge into a mystical philosophy, so deep that it will influence spiritual seekers for the next 1,800 years. But here's what might shock you. At the center of his mystical system is an understanding of sexual union as the most powerful symbol and possibly the most direct path to reuniting with the divine. What Plotinus created wasn't just philosophy. It was a roadmap for the soul's return to its source, and his insights about how sexual ecstasy mirrors spiritual ecstasy would become the foundation for mystical traditions from Christian contemplatives to Sufi poets to modern tantric practitioners. You're about to discover how this ancient philosopher changed our understanding of what happens when physical union becomes a doorway to cosmic consciousness. Plotinus was born in Egypt but studied philosophy in Alexandria, the greatest intellectual center of the ancient world. This was a city where Egyptian priestesses taught sexual magic in temples, where Jewish scholars studied the mystical meanings of the Song of Solomon, where Greek philosophers debated the nature of love, and where early Christians were developing their own understanding of divine love. All of these traditions flowed through Plotinus's brilliant mind and came out as something entirely new. The foundation of Platonian mysticism is breathtakingly simple and infinitely complex. Everything that exists comes from a source he called the One, an ultimate reality beyond all concepts, forms, and descriptions. This one doesn't create the universe through a willful act, but through a kind of cosmic overflow, like light shining from the sun or a scent coming from a flower. And every being, including every human soul, carries within itself an unstoppable longing to return to this source. Here's where sexuality enters the picture in the most profound way imaginable. Plotinus saw that sexual desire provided the closest human comparison to the soul's longing for the One, just as lovers feel an overwhelming pull toward union with each other. The soul feels an overwhelming pull toward union with its divine source. But more than just a comparison, Plotinus suggested that sexual union could actually be a vehicle for spiritual awakening. When approached with the right understanding, let me share one of Plotinus's most beautiful and mysterious passages from his Enneads. The soul in love with beauty streams toward it. It yearns to be united with the beautiful, to give birth to it within itself. But this is not a physical union, though physical union may serve as its symbol and gateway. The soul seeks to become pregnant with beauty itself, to generate within itself the divine forms that exist eternally in the realm of the One. This wasn't just poetic language. Plotinus was describing a specific process of spiritual transformation that he believed could be set off by experiences of deep beauty, including the beauty found in sexual love. When two people come together in deep physical and emotional intimacy, he taught, they create conditions where both souls can remember their divine origin and experience what he called the flight of the alone to the alone. Plotinus developed what might be the most advanced understanding of spiritual ecstasy ever expressed in Western philosophy. He identified 3 stages of mystical union, each one using sexual imagery to describe the soul's growing intimacy with the divine. The first stage, which he called eros, involves passionate longing and pursuit, like the intense attraction between lovers. The second stage, agape, involves self-surrendering love, like the moment when lovers let go of self-consciousness and merge into each other. The third stage, henosis, involves complete union, where the difference between lover and beloved disappears entirely. But here's what makes Plotinus so relevant to modern understanding of sexuality and spirituality. He wasn't calling for celibacy or getting past physical experience. Instead, he was teaching people how to use physical experience, including sexual experience, as a ladder to divine consciousness. The key was learning to see through the physical to the spiritual reality it held. Plotinus taught specific practices for what we might now call sacred sexuality. During moments of physical intimacy, lovers were encouraged to see each other, not just as physical bodies, but as souls temporarily in a body, each carrying within them the light of the one. The practice involves staying aware of this deeper reality, even while fully enjoying physical pleasure. This created what Plotinus called contemplative lovemaking, sexual union marked by presence, reverence, and recognizing the divine in one's partner. Instead of losing consciousness and pleasure, lovers were taught to expand consciousness through pleasure, using physical ecstasy as a doorway to spiritual ecstasy. One of Plotinus's students, Porphyry, recorded specific techniques that his teacher used to guide couples. In this practice, lovers were taught to breathe in, sync, to look into each other's eyes while staying aware of the soul behind the eyes, and to approach climax not as a goal to be reached, but as a gift to be received from the divine. The result, according to these teachings, was sexual experiences that left both partners feeling not tired but energized, not separated but more deeply connected to each other and to the source of all life. Plotinus also developed a sophisticated understanding of what modern psychology calls sexual healing. He saw that sexual trauma often happened when people were treated as just physical objects, rather than being recognized as embodied souls. Healing, therefore, required sexual experiences marked by what he called noetic vision, the ability to see the true spiritual nature of oneself and one's partner, even during physical intimacy. This approach to sexual healing was remarkably advanced for its time and predicts many insights of modern trauma therapy. Plotinus understood that sexual healing required not just physical technique, but rebuilding the ability to see oneself and others as fundamentally sacred and deserving of reverence. The influence of Platonian mysticism on later spiritual traditions was huge. Early Christian mystics like Pseudo-Dionysius and later figures like Meister Eckhart drew heavily on Plotinus's understanding of union with the divine, often using explicitly sexual imagery to describe spiritual experiences. The Sufi poet Rumi's ecstatic verses about divine love show influence from Platonian thought. Even tantric traditions in India developed along remarkably similar lines, suggesting either historical influence or the independent discovery of universal principles. But perhaps the most interesting part of Plotinus's sexual mysticism was his understanding of gender and polarity. Unlike traditions that saw masculine and feminine as fixed categories, Plotinus taught that every soul had both masculine and feminine elements. Sexual union with another person was seen as an external reflection of the external union between these complementary parts of consciousness. This meant that the goal of mystical practice wasn't to get past sexuality, but to fully integrate it, to achieve an internal union between what he called the active and receptive principles within the mind. People who achieved this internal integration often reported that their external sexual relationships became more satisfying and spiritually meaningful as well. Plotinus also had deep insights about the relationship between sexual desire and creative inspiration. He saw that the same energy that drives sexual attraction also drives artistic creation, philosophical insight, and mystical experience. Instead of seeing these as competing forces, he taught practices for changing sexual energy into creative and spiritual energy when it was right, and for letting creative and spiritual energy improve sexual experience when that was more fitting. Modern research on the neurochemistry of both sexual ecstasy and mystical experience has found remarkable similarities that support many of Plotinus's insights. Brain imaging studies show that both sexual climax and deep meditative states involve the temporary dissolving of the sense of a separate self, increased activity in areas linked with transcendence and connection, and the release of brain chemicals linked with bliss and well-being. But Plotinus's mysticism had its challenges and potential problems. His focus on transcendent union could sometimes lead to a devaluing of ordinary human relationships and responsibilities. Some people who interpreted his work became so focused on mystical experience that they ignored practical ethics and social involvement. And the intensity of the experiences he described could be overwhelming for people who weren't psychologically ready for them. Contemporary teachers working with Platonian-inspired practices emphasize the importance of psychological integration and ethical grounding alongside mystical opening. They found that the most transformative sexual spiritual experiences happen within relationships marked by mutual respect, emotional maturity, and real care for each other's well-being. Plotinus also understood that not everyone was meant for this particular path of mystical sexuality. He taught that there were many doorways to the one, and that each person needed to find the approach that fit their personality and situation. For some, the path might involve celibacy and pure contemplation. For others, it might involve the combination of sexuality and spirituality that he explored so deeply. What's remarkable about Platonian mysticism is how it managed to honor both the transcendent and the embodied parts of human experience. Unlike philosophies that saw the body as a prison for the soul, or those that reduced humans to just physical beings, Plotinus saw embodied life as a temporary but meaningful expression of eternal spiritual realities. Have you ever had moments during deep intimacy, sexual or otherwise, where you felt connected to something larger than yourself? What do you think about the idea that physical union could be a doorway to spiritual awakening rather than a distraction from it? The mystical vision that Plotinus expressed of sexuality as a pathway to divine union rather than an obstacle to spiritual development represents one of the most sophisticated combinations of body and spirit ever achieved in Western philosophy. But as our exploration continues, we're about to see a tradition that would take these insights in a dramatically different direction, creating tensions between sexuality and spirituality that continue to influence millions of people today. What happens when mystical insights about divine love meet the practical challenges of building a religious community? We're about to find out as we look into the complex and often contradictory Christian approach to sexuality. From the ecstatic celebrations of divine love in early communities to the struggles with desire that shaped centuries of theological thinking. Imagine you're a young man in North Africa around 370 AD, living a life that would make a modern party animal blush. Your name is Augustine, and you've spent your 20s enjoying every pleasure you can think of: wine, philosophy, passionate love, affairs, and what you'll later describe as an unstoppable hunger for sexual experiences. You've had a child with your mistress whom you genuinely love, and you're living the kind of life that would fit perfectly in ancient Rome's pleasure-seeking culture. But then something happens that will not only change your soul, but also reshape how billions of people think about sexuality for the next 1,600 years. This is the story of perhaps the most influential transformation in the history of human sexuality. How a man who lived fully in the flesh became the architect of ideas that would create centuries of sexual guilt, repression, and internal conflict. But here's what might surprise you. Augustine's struggle wasn't really about rejecting sexuality. It was about discovering something he believed was even more satisfying than physical pleasure. Augustine of Hippo wasn't born a Christian, he discovered it through one of the most psychologically complex spiritual journeys ever recorded. Born in 354 AD in what is now Algeria, Augustine grew up in a world where different philosophical and religious traditions were competing for people's hearts and minds. His mother, Monica, was a devout Christian, but his father was a pagan, and Augustine himself was drawn to the intellectual complexity of Manichaean philosophy and the sensual pleasures of Roman culture. The young Augustine that we see in his Confessions, one of the first and most psychologically deep autobiographies ever written, a man driven by what he called concupiscence, an overwhelming desire for pleasure, knowledge, and experience that could never be satisfied. He writes about his teenage years with shocking honesty. I was in love with loving, and I hated the thought of being safe from danger. I had a hunger for the perilous food of scandal. But Augustine's sexuality wasn't just physical. It was deeply emotional and intellectual, his connection with a woman he never named, who he lived with for more than 15 years, was filled with real love and faithfulness. They had a son together, Adeodatus, and by all accounts, they were a solid, loving family. Augustine's later trouble with sexuality wasn't about sleeping around, but about the hard choice between loving a person and what he came to believe was loving God. The crisis hit when Augustine was in his early 30s, working as a public speaking teacher in Milan. He was engaged to marry a young woman of the right social class, which meant he had to leave his beloved partner and send her back to Africa. The heartbreak of this breakup, along with his growing knowledge of Christian ideas mixed with Plato's philosophy, created the perfect conditions for a huge change in his mind and spirit. Augustine talks about the moment he changed in a way that shows how much he was struggling inside, sitting in a garden in Milan, crushed by the fight between his desires and his growing feeling that God wanted him to live a different way. He heard a child's voice singing "Pick It Up and Read." He opened a copy of Paul's letters and read something that said not to live a life of wild parties, drunkenness, and sleeping around, and not to be jealous or fight. Instead, it said to live like Jesus Christ and not give in to the body's desires. But here's the important thing to understand about Augustine's change. He wasn't turning away from sexuality because he thought it was bad on its own, but because he believed he had found a kind of love that was more fulfilling. Using the ideas from Plato he had studied, Augustine developed a deep understanding of desire as something that points toward God, even when it seems to be pointing toward people. Augustine's famous idea of concupiscence, which is often misunderstood as just sexual desire, was actually a much more complex thought about the mind. He noticed that humans have an endless ability to want things, but that no limited thing can satisfy this endless wanting. Sexual pleasure, romantic love, even the deepest human relationships might make you happy for a little while, but they always left him wanting something more. This led Augustine to what might be his deepest thought about human sexuality. The problem isn't that we want too much, but that we want too little. Our sexual and romantic wants, according to Augustine, are really spiritual wants that have gone in the wrong direction. Attempts to find in human love what can only be found in loving God. He writes, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Augustine's view of sexuality was heavily shaped by his study of Plotinus and the Neoplatonic way of thinking we looked at earlier. Like Plotinus, Augustine saw sexual desire as pointing toward joining with God. But unlike Plotinus, who saw sexual union as a possible path to a mystical experience, Augustine decided that human sexual desire was so spoiled by what he called original sin that it always led away from God instead of toward Him. This is where Augustine's personal life becomes very important for understanding his impact on Christian ideas about sex. His own experience of sexual desire had been tied up with what he saw as selfishness, wanting to own someone, and being unable to truly love another person for who they were instead of for the pleasure they gave him. His relationship with his partner, even though there was real love, had in the end been broken up for social and money reasons that showed the power struggles and self-interest that were under even his deepest human connections. Augustine developed what became the main Christian idea of libido, not just sexual desire, but the basic human habit of using others for our own satisfaction instead of loving them for themselves. This libido, according to Augustine, affected not just sex, but every part of human relationships, making it impossible to love purely without help from God. But Augustine's ideas about sex were more complex than many of the people who came after him understood. He didn't teach that sex itself was a sin. Married couples could enjoy sexual union as long as it was for having children and was done within a committed relationship. What he worried about was the tendency of sexual desire to become what he called Cupidita, selfish love that uses others instead of Carita, selfless love that wants what's best for the person you love. Augustine's Confessions has some of the most insightful writing about sexual attraction ever. He describes the way physical beauty can set off a kind of emotional obsession that stops clear thinking and moral choices. He looks at the psychology of sexual fantasy and how it relates to real human connection. He explores the link between sexual desire and the desire for power, control, and feeling good about yourself. What's amazing about Augustine's thoughts is how much they sound like modern psychological understanding of unhealthy sexual habits. His description of sexual addiction, the way sexual pleasure can become a compulsive way to escape from difficult feelings, predicts modern therapy ideas by more than 1,500 years. His analysis of how sexual relationships can become ways of dealing with unsolved psychological issues, instead of being about real connection, reflects ideas that modern relationship therapy has rediscovered. But Augustine's most debated contribution to Christian sexual ideas was his teaching on original sin and its link to sexuality. Based on his reading of Paul's letters and his own observations of the mind, Augustine decided that the corruption of human nature that came from the fall of man was passed down through the act of sex itself. This meant that every human being was born already infected with the tendency toward selfishness and separation from God. This teaching, which would influence Christian thinking for centuries, is based partly on Augustine's observation that sexual desire often works on its own, without conscious control. He noticed that people could be sexually aroused when they didn't want to be, and unable to get aroused when they did. This seemed to him to be proof that sexuality had been spoiled from its original divine purpose, and now worked in ways that were beyond our control. Augustine's solution to the problem of messed up sexuality was what he called redirection of desire. Learning to love God with the same passion that people naturally felt for human objects of desire. He developed spiritual practices designed to move the energy of sexual wanting toward wanting God, creating what he called chaste love that could embrace others without being possessive or selfish. The influence of Augustine's sexual ideas on Western civilization can't be overstated. His view of sexuality as fundamentally troubled became the foundation for centuries of Christian teaching about being celibate, feeling guilty about sex, and the idea that spiritual love is better than physical love. His thoughts on the psychology of desire influenced not just religion, but books, art, and philosophy throughout the medieval and modern times. But Augustine's legacy is complex and often misunderstood. while his ideas created systems that were used to justify sexual repression and guilt. His actual thoughts about the psychology of desire were remarkably smart and predicted many discoveries of modern psychology. His focus on the importance of why you do things in sexual relationships, his understanding of the link between sexuality and spirituality, and his recognition that healthy love requires being able to genuinely care for others, all remain relevant to today's talks about sexual ethics. Modern therapists working with sexual trauma and addiction often rediscover Augustine's ideas about the way sexual behavior can become compulsive when it's used to meet non-sexual emotional needs. His understanding that sexual healing requires dealing with underlying spiritual and psychological issues, not just changing behavior, is still central to effective treatment today. Augustine's personal journey from a passionate lover to a celibate bishop also gives insights about the different stages of life and how sexual needs and desires can change as people grow psychologically and spiritually. His later writings suggest that while he never regretted his choice to be celibate, he still deeply appreciated the love he had with his partner and the importance of that relationship in his growth as a person. What do you think about Augustine's idea that sexual desire might actually be a misdirected spiritual longing? Have you ever noticed connections between your deepest desires and your search for meaning or a higher power? Augustine's complex legacy, mixing deep psychological insights with religious conclusions that led to centuries of sexual guilt and repression, is a key turning point in how Western civilization understands the relationship between sexuality and spirituality. But as our exploration of ancient wisdom continues, we're about to see a tradition that would approach these same questions from a completely different cultural and philosophical viewpoint. Moving ahead, we'll discover how Islamic philosophers during the Golden Age developed approaches to sexuality that combined strict ethics with smart psychology, creating ways of understanding desire that influenced learning and spirituality across 3 continents and many centuries. In the heart of medieval Baghdad, around 1100 AD, a scholar sits in the House of Wisdom, surrounded by texts from every corner of the known world. Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, Indian mathematics, and the holy writings of Islam. His name is Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, and he's struggling with a question that has bothered him for years. How can a devout Muslim enjoy the physical pleasures that God has created, including sexual pleasure, while still keeping the spiritual focus needed to connect with God? What he discovers will create one of the most balanced and psychologically smart approaches to sexuality ever developed. Ghazali wasn't just any scholar. He was seen as the most brilliant mind of his time, a man who could debate followers of Aristotle in the morning and Sufi mystics in the evening. But his genius wasn't in choosing between a physical and a spiritual life, but in creating a combination that honored both the body and the soul, both human love and divine love, both earthly pleasure and heavenly goals. You're about to discover how thinkers of the Islamic Golden Age developed an understanding of sexuality that was both deeply spiritual and refreshingly practical, and why their insights about combining desire and devotion might be exactly what our modern world needs to hear. Al-Ghazali's approach to sexuality was shaped by a deep personal crisis that almost ruined his career and his faith. At the peak of his intellectual success, teaching hundreds of students at the famous Nizamiya school in Baghdad, he had what we might now call a spiritual and psychological breakdown. Despite his huge knowledge and important position, he felt spiritually empty and disconnected from the divine reality that his studies were supposed to reveal. The turning point came when Al-Ghazali realized he had been living in his head instead of his heart, treating religious knowledge as just information instead of lived wisdom. He quit his teaching job, gave away his money, and spent years traveling as a wandering Sufi, learning to combine intellectual understanding with direct spiritual experience. This journey taught him that spiritual growth couldn't happen by denying human nature, but only by properly integrating and purifying it. When Al-Ghazali returned to scholarship, he brought with him ideas that would change Islamic thinking about sexuality, marriage, and spiritual life. His great work, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, has what might be the most psychologically smart discussion of sexual ethics ever written in the medieval period. And his approach was radically different from the either-or thinking that marked much religious talk about sexuality. Al-Ghazali started with a basic insight from the Quran's teachings. Everything that God has created has a purpose, and can be used for both good and evil, depending on how it's used. Sexual desire, in this view, isn't a problem in itself. It's a divine gift that can either bring people closer to God or distance them from Him. Depending on how it's approached, the Quran itself celebrates sexuality within marriage in very positive ways. One verse says, "And among His signs is that He created for you mates from among yourselves, that you may dwell in tranquility with them, and He has put love and mercy between your hearts." Another verse describes spouses as garments for each other, a metaphor that suggests both protection and close intimacy. But Al-Ghazali did more than just quote scripture. He developed a detailed psychology of sexual desire that explained how sexual relationships could become ways for spiritual growth instead of roadblocks to it. His approach combined strict Islamic ethics with ideas from Greek philosophy, Persian wisdom literature, and his own direct experience as both a married man and a spiritual seeker. According to Al-Ghazali, sexual desire has three essential roles. In human development, first, it ensures that the human race continues, fulfilling God's plan for humans to be stewards of creation. Second, it provides a way for two people to experience the kind of intimate union that is like the soul's relationship with God. Third, it gives opportunities for practicing virtues like patience, generosity, self-control, and compassion that are essential for spiritual growth. But Al-Ghazali's genius was in his practical advice on how to approach sexuality in ways that help spiritual development. He identified what he called the adab of sexual relationships, the proper manners or spiritual discipline that turns physical intimacy into a spiritual practice. This wasn't about imposing strict rules, but about having the right intentions and awareness during intimate moments. For example, Al-Ghazali taught that sexual union should begin with what he called preparation of the heart, a time of prayer, thankfulness, and a conscious intention to approach the experience as a gift from God rather than just a source of personal pleasure. Couples were encouraged to see their physical union as taking part in the divine creative force that brings new life into the world. During intimate moments, Al-Ghazali recommended practices that sound a lot like the tantric approaches we looked at earlier. Couples were encouraged to stay aware of God's presence, to approach each other with reverence and gratitude, and to focus on giving pleasure rather than just receiving it. The goal wasn't to get past physical sensation, but to experience it. As a sign of divine blessing, Al-Ghazali also developed smart insights about the psychology of sexual desire that predict many discoveries of modern relationship research. He saw that sexual satisfaction wasn't just about physical technique, but about emotional connection, mutual respect, and being able to be fully present with one's partner. He wrote a lot about the importance of what he called husn al-moshar, beautiful companionship, creating fulfilling, intimate relationships. One of Al-Ghazali's most practical contributions was his detailed advice about sexual communication and consideration between spouses. He stressed that both partners had rights and responsibilities in a sexual relationship. Men should be attentive to their wives' desires and needs, and women should be open and responsive to their husband's affection. This mutual consideration was seen not just as good relationship practice, but as an essential spiritual discipline. Al-Ghazali's approach to sexual ethics was also remarkably progressive for its time in recognizing women's sexual rights and needs. Drawing on Hadith literature and Islamic legal principles, he argued that sexual satisfaction was a mutual duty in marriage, not just something that women provided for men. He wrote frankly about the importance of foreplay, emotional connection, and making sure that both partners experience pleasure and satisfaction. This focus on mutuality and consideration also applied to Al-Ghazali's understanding of sexual problems and their solutions. He recognized that sexual difficulties often came from emotional disconnection, poor communication, or a lack of spiritual grounding, not just physical issues. His recommended approaches to sexual healing involved addressing the whole person body, mind, and spirit, rather than focusing only on physical symptoms. Al-Ghazali also had deep insights about the relationship between sexual desire and spiritual longing that built on earlier Islamic mystical traditions. Like the Sufi poets who would come after him, he understood that the intense longing felt in romantic and sexual love gave a glimpse into the soul's deeper longing for union with God. But unlike some mystical traditions that saw human love as a distraction from divine love, Al-Ghazali saw them as potentially complementary when approached with the right understanding. The influence of Al-Ghazali's sexual wisdom went far beyond Islamic communities. His works were translated into Latin and influenced Christian thinking about marriage and sexuality throughout the medieval period. Jewish scholars in medieval Spain and North Africa used many of his insights in their own discussions of sexual ethics, and his balanced approach to combining physical pleasure with spiritual purpose became a model for how religious traditions could address sexuality without falling into either repression or indulgence. Modern research on sexual satisfaction and relationship longevity has confirmed many of Al-Ghazali's observations. Studies consistently show that couples who approach sexuality with mutual consideration, emotional connection, and shared meaning report higher levels of satisfaction than those who focus only on physical pleasure or those who treat sexuality as just a biological function. Al-Ghazali's understanding of a sexual relationship as a spiritual practice has also influenced modern approaches to sacred sexuality and mindful intimacy. His focus on intention, presence, and gratitude during intimate moments predicts many techniques used in modern sex therapy and relationship counseling. But perhaps Al-Ghazali's most important contribution was his demonstration that religious devotion and sexual fulfillment could improve rather than compete with each other. His own life was an example of this combination. He was married, had children, had an active career as a scholar, and was recognized as one of Islam's greatest spiritual teachers. His approach showed that embracing human sexuality within proper ethical and spiritual frameworks could actually deepen rather than distract from religious commitment. Al-Ghazali also addressed the challenges that come up when sexual desires conflict with spiritual goals. His advice for dealing with sexual temptation, managing times of separation from one's spouse, and keeping spiritual focus during times of intense physical desire provided practical wisdom for navigating the complexities of human sexuality within a religious framework. The Golden Age Islamic approach to sexuality that Al-Ghazali represented was marked by what we might call integrated wisdom, the recognition that human beings are at once physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual creatures, and that healthy sexuality requires attention to all these parts. This holistic approach avoided both the dualistic thinking that separates body from spirit and the reductionist thinking that reduces humans to just physical beings. What strikes you as most important about Al-Ghazali's approach to combining sexuality and spirituality? Have you experienced conflicts between physical desires and spiritual goals? And how have you worked to solve them? The sophisticated balance that Islamic Golden Age thinkers achieved between celebrating sexual pleasure and keeping a spiritual focus represents one of humanity's most successful attempts to create religious frameworks that honor both human nature and divine goals. But as our journey through ancient wisdom comes to an end, we need to look at how these deep insights have been misunderstood, misapplied, and sometimes completely ignored in later interpretations. As we near the end of our exploration, we'll discover how modern people consistently misinterpret ancient sexual wisdom, creating problems that the original teachers never intended. And these common mistakes might explain why so many people today struggle to find the combination of sexuality and spirituality that our ancestors achieved with such remarkable success. Here's the irony that would make ancient philosophers cry. We live in the most sexually free era in human history. Yet we're more confused about sexuality than any generation before us. After spending these hours exploring the deep wisdom that ancient thinkers developed about desire, love, and the soul, we need to face an uncomfortable truth. Modern people consistently misinterpret, misapply, and completely miss the point of these ancient teachings. And these misunderstandings aren't just academic mistakes. They're creating sexual and spiritual problems that the original teachers never intended and would have known how to solve. You're about to discover the 5 most common ways that modern culture gets ancient sexual wisdom completely wrong. And recognizing these mistakes might be the key to finally bringing the insights. We've been exploring into your own life in ways that actually work. Let's start with perhaps the most common misunderstanding of ancient sexual wisdom: the belief that ancient philosophers were either completely for sex or completely against it. Walk into any bookstore today, and you'll find books claiming that. The ancients celebrated sexuality, sitting right next to books arguing that traditional religion suppressed sexuality. Both views miss the subtle, smart approaches that we've been exploring. Take Plato's Ladder of Love, for example. Modern interpretations usually present this as either Plato thought physical love was bad and spiritual love was good, or Plato believed in free love and sexual liberation. Both readings completely miss Plato's actual insight that physical attraction is the beginning of wisdom, not the end of it. Plato wasn't condemning sexual desire. He was saying it points toward something even more fulfilling. I've seen people try to use Plato's philosophy to justify either complete sexual abstinence or unlimited sexual experimentation, when Plato was actually teaching something much more sophisticated: how to use the energy of sexual attraction as fuel for personal and spiritual development. He was describing a process, not telling people how to live. The same misunderstanding affects how people interpret Stoic teachings about desire. Modern self-help books often present Stoicism as just don't care about anything or suppress all emotions. But Marcus Aurelius and Seneca weren't teaching emotional numbness. They were teaching emotional wisdom. They practiced observing desires without being controlled by them, which is completely different from suppressing desires or pretending they don't exist. This leads to our second major mistake: treating ancient sexual wisdom as a list of rules rather than a set of principles for developing wisdom. Ancient philosophers weren't mainly interested in telling people what to do sexually. They were interested in helping people develop the kind of character and understanding that would let them make wise choices about sexuality for themselves. Think about how people misinterpret Buddhist teachings about desire. You'll often hear people say, Buddhism teaches that desire is the root of all suffering, so we should get rid of sexual desire. But the Buddha's actual teaching was much more subtle. It's not desire itself that causes suffering, but attachment to desire, the desperate need for things to be different than they are. Buddhists' mindfulness practices around sexuality aren't about getting rid of sexual feelings, but about developing a different relationship with them. The goal is to experience sexual desire when it comes up without being a slave to it, and to engage in sexual experiences when it's right, without being obsessed with specific results. This is the difference between wisdom and repression. The third mistake is even more common: picking and choosing quotes and practices from ancient traditions without understanding their cultural and philosophical context. This is how you end up with people doing tantric practices that have nothing to do with actual tantric philosophy or claiming to follow Taoist sexual techniques while completely ignoring Taoist ethics and spiritual goals. I've met people who read about Egyptian sacred sexuality and decide that means they should have sex in public or with multiple partners, completely missing the smart framework of ritual preparation, mutual respect, and spiritual intention that made Egyptian practices meaningful. They take the exotic surface parts while ignoring the wisdom that made those practices work. Similarly, people read about the Song of Solomon and conclude that the Bible celebrates erotic pleasure, which it does, but they miss the context of covenant love, mutual commitment, and the combination of physical passion with spiritual purpose that makes that celebration meaningful. Taking ancient sexual practices out of their ethical and spiritual contexts is like trying to do surgery with medical tools, but no medical knowledge. The fourth major mistake is perhaps the most damaging: using ancient sexual wisdom to justify modern sexual problems rather than to develop sexual health. This happens when people use philosophical ideas to rationalize behavior that's actually harmful to themselves or others. For example, I've seen people use Cynic philosophy about sexual freedom to justify treating sexual partners as objects rather than as full human beings. They quote Diogenes' ideas about natural sexuality while completely ignoring the Cynic focus on virtue, authenticity, and real care for others. They use philosophical ideas to dress up selfishness as wisdom. Similarly, people sometimes misuse Epicurean ideas about pleasure to justify sexual addiction or compulsive behavior. They focus on Epicurus' teaching that pleasure is the highest good, while ignoring his smart analysis of which pleasures actually lead to happiness, and which ones create more suffering than satisfaction. The fifth mistake might be the most subtle, but also the most important: treating ancient sexual wisdom as something separate from overall human development, rather than as one part of becoming a mature, wise, and emotionally healthy person. Ancient philosophers understood that sexual wisdom was inseparable from psychological wisdom, ethical development, and spiritual growth. Modern culture often puts sexuality in a box, treating it as either purely biological or purely for fun, separate from questions of character, meaning, and personal development. But every ancient tradition we've explored understood that how you approach sexuality reveals and shapes who you are as a human being. Confucian sexual ethics can't be separated from Confucian ideas about virtue, social responsibility, and character development. Taoist sexual practices only make sense within the broader Taoist understanding of natural flow, energy cultivation, and harmony with cosmic principles. Islamic sexual wisdom is meaningless without the Islamic framework of spiritual devotion, ethical behavior, and submission to divine will. This compartmentalization leads to approaches to sexuality that may be technically smart, but lack the depth and integration that makes sexual experiences truly fulfilling. People learn sexual techniques without developing the emotional maturity, ethical sensitivity, and spiritual awareness that allow those techniques to serve love rather than just pleasure. Another common mistake is treating ancient sexual wisdom as if it were scientific data rather than practical philosophy developed through lived experience and careful observation. Ancient philosophers weren't doing controlled studies. They were developing insights through personal experimentation, careful observation of human nature, and talking with other thoughtful people. This means that ancient sexual wisdom needs to be tested and adapted rather than just applied. What worked for a Roman Stoic or a medieval Islamic scholar might need to be changed for someone living in 21st century America. The principles are still relevant, but how they're applied requires wisdom, experimentation, and adaptation to current circumstances. For example, ancient insights about the relationship between sexual desire and spiritual longing are still psychologically valid. But the specific practices for combining sexuality and spirituality need to be adapted to modern relationship structures, gender roles, and cultural expectations. The mistake of idealizing history is also common, assuming that ancient cultures had healthier approaches to sexuality than we do today, while ancient philosophers developed deep insights about sexuality. They were also limited by the knowledge and social structures of their time. Ancient Greek sexual practices included slavery and relationships between men and boys. Ancient Roman sexuality included widespread exploitation and abuse. Ancient cultures often had severe limits on women's sexual freedom. The goal isn't to go back to ancient sexual practices, but to learn from ancient sexual wisdom, to pull out the insights about human nature, desire, and fulfillment that are still relevant while adapting them to modern ethical standards and social structures. Perhaps the most dangerous mistake is using ancient sexual wisdom to avoid dealing with modern psychological and relationship challenges. Some people become so fascinated by ancient tantric practices or medieval mystical teachings that they use them to escape from the hard work of developing emotional intimacy, communication skills, and psychological maturity in their actual relationships. Ancient sexual wisdom can improve modern relationships, but it can't replace the basic relationship skills that any successful partnership needs: honest communication, emotional availability, resolving conflicts, and real care for each other's well-being. No amount of tantric breathing or Taoist energy circulation will fix a relationship that lacks trust, respect, and emotional connection. What's your experience with trying to apply insights from traditional, spiritual, or philosophical teachings to modern life? Have you ever found yourself making any of these mistakes in your own approach to sexuality or relationships? The misunderstandings we've explored show something important about the difference between information and wisdom. We have access to more information about ancient sexual teachings than any generation before us, but information without the right context, ethical grounding, and practical wisdom can actually create more confusion than clarity. This brings us to the most important question of our entire journey. How do we actually bring the deep insights we've discovered into our modern lives in ways that help us truly flourish, rather than just being intellectually curious? The answer involves not just understanding ancient wisdom, but developing the kind of character and awareness that lets that wisdom change how we actually live and love. What if everything you think you know about applying ancient wisdom to modern life is backward? Most people assume that bringing philosophical insights into modern relationships means learning new techniques or adopting different beliefs. But here's what might change your whole approach. The ancient masters weren't mainly teaching techniques, they were developing character. And the difference between technique and character is the difference between temporary improvement and lasting change. After exploring thousands of years of human wisdom about sexuality and the soul, we've come to the most practical question of all. How do you actually live this wisdom in a world of dating apps, social media, performance anxiety, and relationship confusion? The answer isn't what most people expect, and it's going to challenge some basic assumptions about how personal growth actually works. Let me tell you about Sarah, a combination of dozens of people I've met who tried to apply ancient sexual wisdom to their modern relationships. Sarah discovered tantric practices and became fascinated by the idea of sacred sexuality. She learned breathing techniques, studied chakra theory, and even went to workshops on conscious intimacy. But despite all this knowledge, her relationships were still unsatisfying, filled with the same patterns of attraction, disappointment, and confusion that had always been part of her romantic life. Sarah's experience shows the most important insight about applying ancient wisdom. Information without change is just smart entertainment. The ancient philosophers we've explored weren't trying to give people new techniques to improve their sex lives. They were helping people become the kind of people who could love well, desire wisely, and find fulfillment through character rather than just through circumstances. The first principle for bringing ancient sexual wisdom into modern life is what I call inside-out development. Starting with your relationship with yourself, rather than trying to improve your relationships with others. Every tradition we've explored understood that external relationships could only be as healthy as your internal relationship with your own desires, fears, and motivations. Think about how this works practically. Plato's ladder of love isn't really about finding the right person to climb the ladder with. It's about developing the ability to see beauty and meaning in progressively deeper ways. A person who can only appreciate physical beauty will struggle in any long-term relationship, no matter how attractive their partner is. But someone who has learned to see intellectual beauty, emotional beauty, and spiritual beauty will find sources of attraction and connection that don't fade with time. This means that the practical application of Platonic love theory isn't learning new dating strategies, but developing what philosophers call aesthetic education, training yourself to see and appreciate different forms of beauty. This might involve spending time in nature, studying art or poetry, having philosophical conversations, or practicing meditation. These activities gradually expand your ability for appreciation and wonder, which changes how you see potential. Partners. The Stoic approach offers another powerful example of inside-out development. Marcus Aurelius's insights about desire weren't mainly about managing sexual urges, but about developing what Stoics called prochuron, continuous attention to your own mental and emotional processes. The practical application isn't learning to suppress desires, but learning to observe them with clarity and respond with wisdom. Here's a specific Stoic practice that can change your relationship with sexual desire. Before getting into any romantic or sexual situation, pause and ask yourself 3 questions that Marcus Aurelius would have recognized. What do I actually want from this experience? What am I hoping it will do for my overall well-being? And what would I do differently if I were approaching this situation with virtue as my main goal rather than pleasure or validation? This isn't about becoming calculating or unromantic. It's about bringing consciousness to choices that people often make without thinking. Stoic practitioners report that this kind of self-examination actually improves their ability for real intimacy because it removes the desperation, manipulation, and self-deception that often get in the way of authentic connection. The Buddhist principle of mindful awareness offers perhaps the most practical tool for combining ancient wisdom with modern sexuality. But authentic Buddhist mindfulness is much more challenging than the popular mindfulness that's often taught. In self-help books, real mindfulness involves what the Buddha called bare attention, observing your experience without immediately trying to change it, fix it, or make it different. When applied to sexuality, this means learning to notice sexual desire when it comes up without immediately acting on it or pushing it away. It means being present during intimate experiences, without constantly judging your performance or comparing your experience to fantasies. It means developing what modern mindfulness teachers call response flexibility, the ability to choose how to respond to sexual feelings, rather than being automatically driven by them. Here's a practical Buddhist exercise that can change your sexual experiences. During intimate moments, practice what meditation teachers call silently noticing what's happening in your body, emotions, and mind without judgment. You might mentally note arousal arising, anxiety appearing, pleasure present, or distraction happening. This isn't about analyzing your experience, but about staying present to it rather than getting lost in thoughts about the past or future. People who practice this kind of mindful sexuality report that it actually increases rather than decreases pleasure because it removes the mental layer that often gets in the way of a natural sexual response. When you're not constantly judging your performance or worrying about outcomes, you can actually experience what's happening in the present moment. The combination of Eastern and Western philosophical approaches offers even more powerful possibilities. For personal development, a Confucian focus on developing virtue can be combined with a Taoist understanding of natural flow to create relationships that are both ethically solid and full of energy. Hebrew insights about covenantal love can be combined with Greek insights about beauty and truth to create partnerships that serve both personal fulfillment and larger purposes. But perhaps the most important principle for applying ancient wisdom is what I call an experimental attitude, approaching these insights as ideas to test rather than rules to follow. The ancient philosophers were empiricists who developed their insights through careful observation of what actually worked to create a good life. They would expect you to test their ideas against your own experience rather than just accepting them as true. This means starting small and building up gradually. Instead of trying to completely change your approach to sexuality based on ancient teachings, choose one insight that you connect with and experiment with it for several weeks. Notice what changes in your experience, your relationships, and your posture, and your overall well-being, and slowly add other insights as they prove useful. For example, you might start by experimenting with the Egyptian practice of seeing sexual partners as embodied souls rather than just physical bodies. Before intimate encounters, take a moment to look into your partner's eyes and consciously recognize their essential humanity and dignity. Notice how this changes your experience of physical connection. Or you might experiment with the Islamic practice of approaching sexuality with gratitude and intention rather than just spontaneous desire. Before sexual experiences, take a moment to feel grateful for the opportunity for intimate connection and set an intention to approach the experience with presence and care for your partner's well-being. The key is finding approaches that improve rather than complicate your natural ability for love and connection. Ancient wisdom should make your relationships more fulfilling, not more difficult. If applying philosophical insights creates more anxiety, self-consciousness, or distance from your partner, you're probably misunderstanding or overcomplicating the teachings. Ancient sexual wisdom also offers powerful tools for healing sexual trauma and dysfunction. Many of the practices we've explored: mindful awareness, gradual exposure, combining body and spirit, predict modern therapeutic approaches. But the ancient focus on character development and spiritual grounding provides resources for healing that purely psychological approaches sometimes miss. For example, the Stoic understanding that you can't control external circumstances, but you can control your responses offers hope for people dealing with sexual trauma. The Buddhist insight that painful experiences are temporary and don't define who you are provides a framework for healing that goes beyond just managing symptoms. The Hebrew understanding of sexuality as reflecting divine love offers a vision of healing that involves not just recovery, but transformation. Modern research on post-traumatic growth has confirmed that people who find meaning in their difficult experiences often develop greater resilience, deeper relationships, and a better appreciation for life than they had before their trauma. Ancient wisdom traditions understood this possibility and developed practices specifically designed to turn suffering into wisdom. But applying ancient sexual wisdom to healing requires patience, professional support when needed, and realistic expectations about the process of recovery. Philosophy can provide valuable frameworks for understanding and finding meaning, but it can't replace proper therapeutic treatment when dealing with serious trauma or dysfunction. Combining ancient wisdom with modern life also requires adapting insights to current social and technological realities. Ancient philosophers didn't have to deal with online dating, social media, or the sexual images that constantly surround us in modern culture. But their insights about desire, attachment, and character development are relevant to navigating these modern challenges. For example, Stoic practices for managing desire are highly relevant to dealing with internet pornography or the comparison and envy caused by social media. Buddhist mindfulness can help people develop healthier relationships with dating apps and online profiles. A Confucian focus on assessing character can guide decisions about which relationships to pursue and which to avoid. Which of these approaches feels most relevant to your current relationship challenges? Have you ever tried applying philosophical or spiritual insights to your romantic life? What was that experience like? The change that comes from truly. Combining ancient sexual wisdom isn't just about having better relationships or more satisfying sexual experiences, though those often happen. It's about becoming a more complete human being, someone who can love deeply without losing themselves, desire passionately without being a slave to desire, and find meaning in both physical pleasure and spiritual goals. As we move toward the end of our journey through ancient wisdom about sexuality and the soul, it's time to gather the ideas we've been exploring and weave them into a practical vision for how this timeless knowledge can change not just your intimate relationships, but your whole approach to living as an embodied spiritual being in the modern world. As we reach the end of our amazing journey through 2,500 years of human wisdom about sexuality and the soul, I want to leave you with something that might change everything. The realization that you already have the ability for the kind of integrated, fulfilling approach to love and desire that these ancient masters spent their lives developing. The wisdom we've explored isn't exotic knowledge from faraway cultures. It's insight into human nature that's as relevant tonight as it was in Plato's Athens or Al-Ghazali's Baghdad. Let me share with you the deepest lesson that comes from all these different traditions, and then offer you a practical framework for living this wisdom that you can start using right away. Because here's what every philosopher we've met understood: the goal isn't to become someone different, but to become more fully who you already are at your deepest level. Throughout our journey, we've found that every great tradition came to remarkably similar insights about the relationship between sexuality and spiritual fulfillment. From Plato's understanding that physical attraction points toward perfect beauty, to the Buddha's insight that desire becomes suffering only when we cling to it, to Al-Ghazali's recognition that sexual union can help spiritual development, all of these teachings point toward the same basic truth. That truth is this: sexuality and spirituality aren't opposites that need to be balanced, but different expressions of the same basic human ability for connection, transcendence, and love. The ancient masters weren't trying to escape their humanity through spiritual practice. They were trying to fulfill their humanity by combining all parts of their nature into a complete whole. This combination creates what I call embodied wisdom, the ability to live fully in your body while staying connected to deeper sources of meaning and purpose. People who achieve this combination report that their sexual experiences become more satisfying, their relationships become more stable and fulfilling, and their overall sense of well-being increases dramatically. But here's the practical framework that can help you begin this combination right away, drawn from the best insights of every tradition we've explored. First, develop what the Stoics call procheron continuous, gentle attention to your own motivations and desires. Before making any big choice about relationships or sexuality, pause and ask yourself, what am I really looking for through this experience? Am I looking for real connection, or am I trying to fill an emotional hole? Am I approaching this person with respect and care, or am I mainly concerned with my own satisfaction? This isn't about becoming self-conscious or analytical, but about bringing consciousness to choices that affect your deepest well-being. Ancient philosophers understood that most relationship problems come from unconscious motivations rather than external situations. Second, practice what Buddhists call mindful awareness in your intimate relationships. This means being fully present during conversations, physical intimacy, and even arguments, rather than being lost in thoughts about the past or worries about the future. When you're genuinely present with another person, you create space for the kind of deep connection that every human soul craves. Third, cultivate what the Hebrew tradition understood as covenantal love, the commitment to want what's best for your partner. even when it conflicts with your immediate desires. This doesn't mean self-sacrifice or people-pleasing, but rather the recognition that true love serves the other person's authentic growth, which in the end serves your own as well. Fourth, embrace what Taoists called wu, effortless action, in harmony with the natural flow. In relationships, this means learning when to act and when to let things happen, when to pursue and when to receive, when to speak and when to listen. This natural rhythm creates the kind of ease and joy that makes relationships last over time. Finally, integrate what Egyptian and other ancient traditions understood about sexuality as a sacred force. Approach intimate moments with reverence, gratitude, and an awareness that you're taking part in the same creative energy that brings all life into being. This doesn't require religious belief, but simply a recognition that sexual connection involves something profound and worthy of respect. The remarkable thing about these practices is that they work whether you're single or with a partner, whether you're dealing with relationship challenges or just want to deepen existing connections. They're not techniques for getting what you will want from others, but methods for becoming the kind of person who naturally attracts healthy relationships and experiences fulfilling intimacy. Modern neuroscience research has confirmed what ancient philosophers knew intuitively. People who practice these kinds of awareness and character development literally change their brain structure in ways that improve their ability for empathy, emotional regulation, and intimate connection. The practices that ancient masters developed for spiritual reasons turn out to have measurable effects on psychological and relationship well-being. But perhaps the most important insight from our journey is this: the combination of sexuality and spirituality isn't a destination you reach, but a process you live. Every relationship, every intimate encounter, every moment of desire or attraction becomes a chance to practice wisdom, develop character, and deepen your understanding of what it means to be human. This means that your current relationship challenges aren't roadblocks to get over, but lessons for your growth. The person who makes you jealous is teaching you about attachment. The relationship that didn't work out is showing you patterns that need attention. The sexual difficulties you face are pointing toward areas where healing and growth are possible. The ancient masters would tell you that there's no perfect relationship waiting for you somewhere in the future. There's only the chance to bring wisdom, compassion, and presence to whatever relationships you have now. And they would assure you that developing these qualities will naturally attract the kind of connections that serve your deepest fulfillment. What strikes me most deeply about the wisdom we've explored is how it offers hope without false promises. Ancient philosophers didn't claim that following their teachings would get rid of all relationship difficulties or guarantee perfect sexual satisfaction. But they showed that approaching sexuality and relationships with wisdom, character, and spiritual awareness creates possibilities for fulfillment that go beyond temporary circumstances. Whether you're 19 or 90, whether you're struggling with sexual dysfunction or enjoying satisfying intimacy, whether you're searching for your first love or healing from your latest heartbreak, the insights we've discovered offer practical guidance for your current situation, because the basic human needs for connection, meaning, and love don't change, even though the situations in which we look for them are always shifting. As you go forward from here, I encourage you to experiment with these insights rather than just thinking about them. Choose one practice that you connect with and try it for a few weeks. Notice what changes in your relationships, your understanding of yourself, and your overall sense of well-being. Let your own experience be your guide, just as it was for the ancient philosophers who developed these teachings through their own experimentation with the art of living well. And remember this: you don't need to be a perfect person to enjoy fulfilling relationships. You don't need to solve all your psychological issues before you can love or be loved. You don't need to choose between being spiritual and being sexual. The path of integration that ancient wisdom offers is available to you exactly as you are right now, in whatever circumstances you find yourself. The philosophers we've met, from Plato in his academy to Al-Ghazali in his studies, from Marcus Aurelius on the battlefield to the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, would tell you that the ability for wisdom, love, and fulfillment already exists within you. Their teachings are simply methods for uncovering and developing what's already there. As we finish this exploration of how ancient philosophers understood the relationship between sexuality and the soul, I'm filled with gratitude that you've joined me on this journey. We've traveled across continents and thousands of years, discovering insights that are as relevant today as they were long ago. We've learned that the greatest minds in human history didn't see sexuality as separate from spirituality, but as one of the most powerful paths to understanding what it means to be fully human. Thank you for listening with such attention and openness. Thank you for being willing to consider that there might be wisdom in these ancient teachings that could change your modern relationships. And thank you for recognizing that how we love and desire matters not just for our personal happiness, but for the kind of world we create together. I hope these insights serve you well in your own journey toward integration, fulfillment, and love. And I hope you'll stay tuned for our next exploration of how ancient wisdom can shed light on modern challenges. Until then, may your relationships be sources of growth, your desires be guided by wisdom, and your love be a reflection of the deepest truth about who you are. Sleep well and dream of the beautiful possibilities that wait when sexuality and spirituality dance together in harmony.